The forest around Black Hollow had always been dense, but tonight it felt suffocating. The air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves, a tangible weight pressing down on my chest. My flashlight cut a narrow beam through the darkness, but it was barely enough. Shadows danced at the edges of my vision, thick and restless. And the further I ventured, the less certain I was that I wanted to find what I was looking for. They had disappeared 3 days ago. A family of 4, living in a small cabin on the edge of the woods, gone without a trace. No signs of a struggle, no broken locks or windows. Just an empty home with dinner still on the table and a dog pacing the yard, whining at the tree line. Search parties had combed the forest, calling their names and leaving markers behind. But by the second day, people started pulling out. The woods were wrong, too quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing but the creak of branches in the wind and the occasional snap of a twig beneath someone's boot. It was enough to unsettle anyone, even seasoned searchers. That's when they called me. I'm not a cop. I'm not a park ranger or some kind of tracker either. I'm a private investigator. The kind people call when they don't trust official channels. I'd seen my share of strange cases over the years. People vanishing without explanation. Places that didn't feel quite real. But this one had a weight to it. A heaviness I couldn't shake. It clung to me now as I stepped deeper into the woods, the beam of my flashlight flickering against the tangled undergrowth. The deeper I went, the worse it got. The trail was faint, barely more than a suggestion of footprints and bent grass, but it led steadily west, toward the old Black Hollow mine. No one had worked the mine in decades. So would the The entrance was supposed to be sealed, condemned after a collapse in the early 1900s, killed nearly 24 workers. But as I moved closer, I saw signs of recent activity. Scrapes in the dirt, broken branches, and something that made my stomach twist. Symbols carved into the trees. At first, I thought they were old graffiti, the kind of crude markings teenagers might leave behind during drunken dares. But as my flashlight played across them, I realized they were anything but crude. The lines were precise, intricate, and they crawled over the bark in patterns that made my skin crawl. They looked old, impossibly old, yet the edges were sharp and fresh, as though they'd been etched only hours ago. I reached out, hesitating, just before my fingers brushed the surface. The air around them felt colder, the kind of chill that numbed your skin in an instant. I pulled back, swallowing hard, and kept moving. The mine entrance loomed ahead, a yawning black maw in the side of a rocky hill. The boards that once sealed it were gone, splintered and scattered across the ground, as though something had burst out from the inside. The ground around the entrance was churned up, the dirt mixed with what looked like ash, and I could see more of those symbols scrawled across the stone archway. They pulsed faintly in the darkness. The glow so faint, I might have thought I was imagining it, If not for the pit forming in my stomach, I wasn't alone. Yes. Oh, at first I thought it was just my nerves, the way your mind conjures things in the dark. But then I heard it, soft and distant, like the rustle of leaves in the wind. Only there was no wind. The air was dead still, heavy with the kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums and made your thoughts feel louder. I stopped, turning slowly, the flashlight beam sweeping across the trees. Nothing moved, but the sound didn't stop. It was closer now, a faint whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I stepped toward the mine entrance, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Whatever was out here, I didn't want to meet it in the open. The darkness of the mine felt safer. If only slightly. As I crossed the threshold, the air shifted. It wasn't just cooler. It felt thicker, heavier, like wading into water. My flashlight flickered again, the beam cutting through a haze of dust and settling on the ground ahead. Tracks. They led into the mine, faint impressions in the dirt that couldn't have been more than a day old. Shoes, not boots, small ones. I followed them, each step echoing in the narrow tunnel. The walls were close, the air damp and metallic, carrying the faint scent of decay. The symbols were everywhere now, etched into the stone, their glow pulsing in time with the whispers that had followed me into the dark. They were louder here, more distinct, but still just out of reach, like hearing a conversation through a wall. My skin prickled as I moved deeper, the unease settling into a cold knot at the base of my spine. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, and I froze. The footprints ended abruptly in the center of the room, where the ground was covered in a strange, blackened residue. It wasn't ash or soot. It shimmered faintly in the flashlight beam, like oil. The walls of the chamber were covered in carvings, more intricate and detailed than any I'd seen before. They depicted figures, twisted, elongated shapes that seemed to move when I looked at them too long. My stomach churned, a wave of nausea rolling over me, and I forced myself to look away. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the chamber, partially buried in the stone, was a door. It wasn't like any door I'd ever seen before. It wasn't wood or metal. It looked organic, its surface dark and smooth, like polished obsidian. The same symbols covered it, glowing faintly, and as I stepped closer, I felt the air shift again. The whispers rose to a crescendo, a chaotic symphony of voices overlapping, too many to count. I couldn't understand them, but their intent was clear. Leave out. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I thought I might obey. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to get out while I still could. But then I saw something else, a faint outline, barely visible against the surface of the door. A handprint, small and smudged, like a child's. I reached out, my hand trembling, and brushed my fingers against the surface. The door was warm, pulsing faintly beneath my touch, and the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, crushing, and then the ground beneath me began to tremble. The ground shook beneath my feet, a low rumble that started deep below and climbed steadily until the walls of the chamber seemed to vibrate with it. Dust cascaded from the ceiling, filling the air with a choking haze. I staggered back from the door, my pulse hammering in my ears, as the faint glow of the symbols on its surface flickered, dimming and brightening like a heartbeat. The trembling intensified, and for a moment I thought the entire mine might collapse, burying me along with whatever was behind that door. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the shaking stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It pressed against my skull, thick and oppressive, amplifying every shallow breath, every rustle of the loose gravel beneath my boots. The faint hum I'd felt earlier was back now, stronger than before, resonating deep in my chest like the echo of something ancient and immense. I didn't want to stay in that chamber any longer, but something rooted me in place. The door seemed to call to me, its surface shifting faintly, as if whatever was behind it was trying to press through. I shined my flashlight on the carvings again, forcing myself to study them despite the nausea churning in my stomach. The figures weren't just twisted, they were incomplete. Some were missing heads, others limbs, their forms interrupted by jagged lines and deep gouges in the stone. It looked deliberate, as if someone had tried to deface them, to obscure whatever story they were meant to tell. But there was one carving that stood out, untouched and pristine. A towering figure loomed at its center, its body an impossible tangle of limbs and eyes, its mouth wide open in a silent scream. Surrounding it were smaller figures, their heads bowed in supplication, their arms raised toward the towering shape as if in offering. A sudden sound snapped me out of my trance, a sharp, metallic scrape that echoed from somewhere deeper in the mine. I spun around, the beam of my flashlight darting across the chamber. The sound came again, closer this time, and my stomach tightened into a knot. It wasn't just the noise that unnerved me. It was the rhythm of it, deliberate and steady, like footsteps on metal. I took a step back, my boot crunching on loose gravel, and the sound stopped. The flashlight beam wavered in my hand as I scanned the tunnel I'd come from, but there was nothing there. Just the same suffocating darkness, pressing in from all sides. I thought about calling out, but the words caught in my throat. Somehow, I knew that whatever was making that noise wasn't something I wanted to alert to my presence. The silence stretched, taut, and brittle, and I took another step back, my breath hitching as the edge of my boot scraped against the strange, black residue that coated the floor. It felt slick and oily, the kind of texture that clung to your skin no matter how much you tried to wipe it away. I crouched down, shining my flashlight closer, and froze. Embedded in the residue was a fragment of bone, small and jagged, its edges too clean to have been weathered by time. I reached for it, hesitating. Just before my fingers brushed the surface, the hum intensified, rattling the walls, and I jerked my hand back as the sound of footsteps exploded into a frantic sprint. Whatever was in the tunnel wasn't trying to hide anymore. Shudi Bagderland Tormund Fright. It was coming straight for me. I didn't think. I turned and ran, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I stumbled through the chamber and back into the tunnel I'd come from. The air grew colder with every step, the temperature dropping so fast that my breath fogged in the beam of my light. The whispers started again, louder this time, overlapping and urgent, each voice tugging at a different part of my mind. Some were pleading, others mocking, and one, low and guttural, was laughing. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls closing in, the air thicker with every breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that the mine was shifting around me, the path twisting and warping to keep me trapped. The sound of footsteps was relentless, echoing closer and closer, until I could feel the vibrations in the ground beneath me. I reached a fork in the tunnel and hesitated for a fraction of a second, my flashlight darting between the two paths. The left tunnel sloped downward, the air colder and thicker, while the right tunnel climbed upward toward the faintest hint of fresh air. I chose the right, my legs burning with the effort as I scrambled up the incline, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The footsteps followed, impossibly fast, and I knew, without looking, that whatever was chasing me wasn't human. The whispers grew louder, their voices rising to a deafening crescendo, and for a moment, I thought my mind might split apart. My flashlight flickered, the beam dimming and stuttering as I rounded a corner, and I saw the light ahead. The mine entrance was close, the faint gray of the overcast sky visible through the crumbling archway. I pushed myself harder, my legs screaming in protest, as the footsteps behind me broke into a dead sprint. The air felt heavier, the darkness pressing against my back, and I knew that if I stopped, even for a second, it would catch me. I burst through the entrance, the sudden brightness blinding me as I stumbled into the clearing outside. The air was sharp and clean, the sounds of the forest a jarring contrast to the suffocating silence of the mine. I turned, half expecting to see something lunging out of the darkness after me, but the tunnel was empty. The footsteps had stopped. For a moment, I thought I was safe. But then I saw it. The symbols carved into the stone archway weren't faint anymore. They were glowing, pulsing with a sickly green light that seemed to seep into the cracks of the rock. The air around the entrance shimmered faintly, like heat rising from asphalt, and I could feel the hum resonating in my chest again. The mine wasn't just a place. It was a door, and it was open. The forest outside the mine seemed darker than before, as if the shadows from inside had seeped out, spreading through the trees. The air carried a heavy stillness, like the world was holding its breath. I stumbled away from the glowing archway, my chest tight and my breath coming in shallow gasps. The door had opened. At least something had. And I didn't want to know what might come through. I turned to leave, but the hum followed me, faint at first, like an insect buzzing near my ear. The further I walked, the louder it became, resonating in my skull until every thought felt slow and distant, drowned out by the vibration. The trees seemed closer now, their gnarled branches intertwining above me to block out what little light filtered through the clouds. The trail I'd followed to get here was gone, swallowed by the undergrowth. I reached into my pocket, fumbling for the compass I always carried. But when I pulled it out, the needle spun wildly, never settling on north. My flashlight flickered, the beam growing dim and uneven, and I cursed under my breath. Everything about this place was wrong. The rules didn't apply here. Not gravity, not direction, not even time. I had no idea how long I'd been in the woods. Minutes, hours, hours. It all blurred together. I wasn't sure what I was running from. The footsteps I'd heard in the mine were gone, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. It wasn't just paranoia. There was something here, just out of sight, moving when I wasn't looking. I caught glimpses of it in my peripheral vision, a flicker of motion, a shadow darker than the others. But when I turned to face it, there was nothing there. The whispers began again, faint and overlapping, impossible to understand. They weren't coming from any one direction. They were everywhere, surrounding me, pressing into my thoughts. I tried to tune them out, to focus on putting one foot in front of the other, but they grew louder with every step. My flashlight flickered again, and for a moment, I was plunged into total darkness. When the beam came back, I froze. A figure stood on the path ahead, silhouetted against the faint gray light filtering through the trees. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood there, watching me, my breath caught in my throat as the flashlight trembled in my hand. I couldn't see its face, not clearly, but its outline was raw. Its limbs were too long, its posture too rigid, like it was struggling to mimic something human. I took a step back, and the figure tilted its head, as if curious. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I realized, with a sickening certainty, that they were coming from the figure. It wasn't speaking, it was thinking, and its thoughts were leaking into mine. The beam of my flashlight dimmed again, and the figure took a step forward. Its movements were jerky, like a marionette on frayed strings, but each step felt deliberate. I stumbled back, the breath rushing from my lungs as I turned and ran. The forest blurred around me, the trees twisting into unnatural shapes as the whispers rose to a deafening roar. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay. The ground beneath my feet shifted, the dirt crumbling away as I slid down a steep embankment. My flashlight flew from my hand, bouncing down the slope ahead of me, and I hit the ground hard, the impact jarring every bone in my body. For a moment, I lay there, dazed and disoriented, my breath hitching in my chest. The whispers had stopped, leaving an oppressive silence in their wake. I reached for my flashlight, my fingers brushing against the cold metal, and clicked it back on. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a shallow ravine lined with jagged rocks and twisted roots. At the far end, partially hidden by the undergrowth, was a structure. It was small and crude, made of weathered wood and rusted metal, like a shed or an old hunting blind. But it wasn't abandoned. The faint glow of a lantern flickered inside, casting long shadows across the uneven ground. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But something drew me forward. The hum was back, faint but steady, vibrating through the air like a pulse. I stepped closer, my flashlight sweeping over the structure's walls. Hey! Symbols were carved into the wood, the same intricate patterns I'd seen in the mine. Some of them were faded, worn down by time, but others looked fresh, the edges sharp and clean. The door was ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. I pushed it open, the rusted hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The air was damp and stale, carrying the faint metallic tang of blood. The lantern sat on the floor, its flickering light illuminating the cramped space. A figure crouched in the corner, its back to me, its shoulders rising and falling with shallow, ragged breaths. "Hello?" My voice was barely more than a whisper, but the figure stiffened at the sound. Slowly, it turned its head, and I felt my stomach drop. It was a man, or what was left of one. His skin was pale and mottled, stretched tight over sharp cheekbones and hollow eyes. His lips moved soundlessly, his jaw trembling as if trying to form words, but no sound came out. His hands were clawed, his fingers digging into the dirt floor as he dragged himself closer to the lantern. "Help," he rasped, the word barely audible. His voice was raw, broken, as though it hadn't been used in years. "It won't let me leave." I took a step back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. "What won't let you leave?" The man's gaze flicked past me, his eyes widening with terror. "Here," he whispered. Before I could turn, the lantern's light went out. The darkness was absolute, swallowing me whole. The hum surged, a deep, resonant vibration that rattled my teeth and made the ground tremble beneath me. The whispers returned, louder than ever, their voices overlapping in a chaotic cacophony that pressed against my skull. Something moved in the darkness, a shadow within shadows, and I felt its presence, vast and ancient and impossibly cold. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on the edge of the doorway, and fell into the dirt outside. The flashlight flickered back to life, its beam cutting through the darkness just long enough to catch a glimpse of the figure inside. The man was gone, replaced by something that shouldn't exist, something with too many limbs and no face, its body twisting and writhing as it surged toward me. I didn't think. I turned and ran, the whispers chasing me through the trees, their voices echoing in my mind long after I'd left the ravine behind. The forest was relentless, its shadows stretching longer, darker, as if they were alive and reaching for me. My lungs burned as I ran, every step driving me further into the unknown. The whispers weren't just following me anymore. They were inside me, curling around my thoughts like smoke, tainting every flicker of rationality with dread. The flashlight in my hand flickered, its beam weak and sporadic, and I knew it wouldn't hold out much longer. I stumbled over a root, my knee slamming into the damp earth, and for a moment, I just stayed there, gasping for air. The darkness around me pulsed, shifting in ways that defied logic, and the whispers quieted, replaced by a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from the ground itself. It wasn't a reprieve. It was the calm before the storm. Empty, detail. I forced myself to stand, leaning against a tree for balance, as I scanned my surroundings. The path was gone, swallowed by the forest, and every direction looked the same. The compass in my pocket was still spinning uselessly, its needle spinning as if caught in a magnetic storm. The only thing guiding me now was instinct, and even that felt unreliable. The hum grew louder, a deep vibration that rattled the ground and sent a fresh wave of nausea rolling through me. I turned toward the sound, not because I wanted to, but because something deep and primal compelled me. It came from the ridge ahead, a jagged line of stone cutting through the forest like an old scar. The air around it shimmered faintly, distorted like heat waves rising off asphalt, but the cold that seeped into my skin was anything but natural. I climbed the ridge, my movements slow and deliberate, each step an effort against the weight pressing down on me. The hum grew louder with every step, burrowing into my skull until I could feel it in my teeth. When I reached the top, the ground leveled out into a clearing, and I stopped dead in my tracks. The clearing was wrong. That was the only way to describe it. The trees formed a perfect circle, their gnarled branches arching over the space like a cathedral, their bark etched with symbols that glowed faintly in the darkness. The ground was bare. The grass scorched black in an uneven spiral that radiated outward from the center, and in the middle of it all was a stone altar, rough and unhewn, its surface stained dark with something I didn't want to identify. I stepped forward, drawn by a force I couldn't explain, my flashlight casting long, flickering shadows across the clearing. The hum was deafening here, vibrating through my bones and setting my teeth on edge. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of decay, and every instinct screamed at me to turn back. But I couldn't. Something was pulling me closer, something vast and cold and ancient. The altar wasn't empty. At first, I thought it was just a bundle of rags, discarded and forgotten. But as I got closer, I saw the truth. It was a body, curled in on itself, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles. The flesh was gray and mottled, stretched taut over sharp bones, and the head was tilted back, the mouth frozen in a silent scream. Symbols were carved into the skin, deep and precise, the edges blackened as if burned. I staggered back, bile rising in my throat, but before I could turn away, the body moved. It wasn't much, just a twitch, a faint spasm of the hand, but it was enough. The hum surged, the vibrations rattling through the clearing. and the symbols on the trees flared brighter, their light harsh and unnatural. The whispers returned, louder this time, a cacophony of voices that filled the air and my mind, drowning out every thought. The body twisted, its movements jerky and unnatural, and its head snapped toward me. The eyes were empty sockets, dark and endless, and the mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear over the roar of the whispers. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my hand as the ground beneath me began to shift. Cracks spiderwebbed outward from the altar, the earth splitting open to reveal a darkness that wasn't just the absence of light. It was something alive, writhing and churning just below the surface. The figure on the altar rose, its limbs moving in ways that defied anatomy, and the whispers coalesced into a single deafening voice. Stay. The word hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs and sending me to my knees. The shadows around the clearing surged forward, closing in, their movements liquid and deliberate. I couldn't move. The weight of the voice pinned me in place, pressing down on my chest until every breath was a struggle. The figure stepped closer, its body bending and twisting, as if it were trying to decide what shape to take. Its empty eyes locked onto mine, and I felt something cold and sharp pierce into my thoughts, rifling through my memories like a thief searching for something to steal. It didn't just see me, it knew me. Every fear, every doubt, every dark corner of my mind was laid bare, and the thing drank it in, growing stronger with every passing second. No, I choked out, my voice barely audible over the roar. I didn't know who I was talking to. The thing myself, the forest, but the word felt important, like a lifeline in the dark. You can't have me. Well, the figure stopped, its head tilting as if considering my defiance. The voice in my mind faltered, the pressure easing just enough for me to draw a shallow, shuddering breath. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling beneath me, and took a step back. The shadows hissed, their edges writhing in agitation, but they didn't advance. I turned and ran, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I sprinted back toward the ridge. The forest closed in around me, the whispers rising to a fever pitch. But I didn't stop. The ground beneath me felt unstable, shifting with every step, but the clearing fell further behind with each stride. I didn't look back. I couldn't. When I finally broke through the tree line, the air hit me like a slap, sharp and cold and real. The forest was silent again, the whispers gone, but the hum lingered, faint and distant, like the echo of a storm that had only just passed. I collapsed onto the ground, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and stared up at the dark sky through the tangled branches above. I wasn't safe, not yet, but I was alive. Thank to stay the power. I was alive, for now. And believe that soul, and do first, harness, dash. I don't remember how long I lay there on the forest floor, staring up at the canopy. My lungs heaved, my throat raw from gasping for air, but the sharp ache in my chest was nothing compared to the oppressive weight in my mind. The whispers were gone, but their echoes lingered, crawling at the edges of my thoughts, daring me to look back. I didn't. I couldn't. The forest had grown quieter. No birds, no wind through the leaves, just a suffocating stillness that felt heavier with each passing second. I forced myself to sit up, every muscle in my body screaming in protest, and scanned my surroundings. The ridge loomed behind me, its jagged silhouette stark against the faint glow of the sky. I could still see the clearing in my mind. The altar, the figure, the symbols that seemed to breathe with their own unnatural rhythm. But here, outside its reach, the world felt almost normal. Almost. Me. I reached into my pocket, pulling out the compass again. The needle was still spinning wildly, defying every natural law. But the longer I stared at it, the more I realized it wasn't random. It pulsed, hesitated, then shifted with a deliberate rhythm, pointing not north, but somewhere else. Somewhere I didn't want to go. I had two choices: ignore it and risk wandering in circles until the forest swallowed me whole, or follow it and hope it led somewhere. Anywhere that would make sense of the nightmare I'd stumbled into. Neither option felt like survival, but at least the compass offered direction. I stood, brushing dirt and debris from my clothes, and began to walk. The forest seemed to shift as I moved, the trees closing in tighter, their gnarled branches intertwining above me like skeletal fingers. The ground beneath my feet grew uneven, the soft loam giving way to jagged stone and roots that clawed their way through the earth. My flashlight flickered, the beam cutting through the darkness in weak, sporadic bursts, and every shadow it revealed seemed to shift just out of sight. The compass led me downhill, the slope growing steeper with each step, until I was half sliding, half stumbling toward the bottom. The air grew colder, the sharp bite of it stinging my skin and clouding my breath in the faint light. When I reached the base of the hill, the ground leveled out into a narrow gorge, its walls rising high on either side like a natural corridor. Water trickled somewhere nearby, faint but constant, and the smell of damp stone filled the air. I followed the gorge, the compass, needle pointing unerringly forward. The path was narrow, the walls pressing in on either side, and the deeper I went, the harder it was to ignore the feeling of being watched. The hum was back, faint and insistent, vibrating through the stone and into my chest. It wasn't coming from the compass. It was coming from ahead. The gorge opened suddenly into another clearing, this one smaller, but no less unsettling. A large, circular stone lay at its center, its surface carved with the same intricate patterns I'd seen in the mine and on the trees. The carvings were deeper here, more deliberate, as if whoever or whatever had made them had poured all their intent into this single place. The hum was deafening now, a deep, resonant thrum that made the air feel alive, electric. My flashlight flickered again, the beam catching on something just beyond the stone. A shape, a person. No, not a person. It stood motionless, its back to me, its silhouette sharp against the faint glow of the carvings. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs too long, and its posture unnaturally rigid, its head tilted slightly, as if listening, and the hum shifted, the tone deepening to something that made my stomach churn. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My mind screamed at me to turn and run, but my body was frozen, trapped in the gravity of whatever was standing before me. The figure moved then, its head turning slowly, deliberately, until it was facing me. It didn't have a face, not really, just smooth, featureless darkness that seemed to drink in the light. But I could feel its eyes on me, pressing into my thoughts, peeling back every layer of resistance, until I was laid bare before it. The hum grew louder, and with it came the whispers, rising in a cacophony of voices that drowned out everything else. They weren't just sounds anymore. They were memories, emotions, fears, my fears. I saw my mother's face, twisted in anger. I heard the voice of someone I'd lost, calling my name from the darkness. I felt the cold grip of failure, the suffocating weight of guilt, each one clawing at me, dragging me down. The figure took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, and I felt the ground beneath me shift. The stone pulsed with light, the carvings flaring brighter, and the whispers changed, growing sharper, more distinct. They weren't just pulling me in. They were inviting me, beckoning me closer to the edge. I stumbled back, my flashlight dropping from my hand and clattering to the ground. The beam rolled, casting erratic shadows across the clearing, and for a brief moment I saw something else. Figures, dozens of them, moving just beyond the trees. They weren't human, their shapes twisted and bent, their limbs elongating and shrinking with every step, their eyes burning like embers in the dark. They circled the clearing, silent but purposeful, their focus fixed on the stone. I turned and ran. The whispers followed, chasing me through the gorge, their voices growing louder, angrier. The ground seemed to shift beneath my feet, the stone rippling like water, and I fell hard, the impact jarring every bone in my body. Pain shot through my leg, but I pushed myself up, forcing my way forward even as the forest closed in around me. The light ahead was faint, barely more than a suggestion of freedom, but it was enough. I threw myself toward it, my breath ragged and my vision swimming, and broke through the tree line into open air. The forest fell silent. I collapsed onto the ground, the world spinning around me, and stared up at the sky. The clouds were heavy, unmoving, their dull gray light casting everything in an ashen pallor. I wasn't safe. And I knew that. The forest wasn't just behind me. It was in me now, its shadows crawling beneath my skin, its whispers etched into my mind. I wasn't alone. Not anymore. The silence after my escape was like a weight pressing down on my chest. I sat there in the clearing, my body trembling, my breath hitching in shallow gasps. The forest loomed at my back, the shadows within it unnaturally still, as if holding their collective breath. The whispers were gone, but they hadn't left. They lingered, waiting for the right moment to return. Just beyond the threshold of thought, I forced myself to move. Every muscle in my body protested, screaming with exhaustion and pain. But staying in one place wasn't an option. The clearing offered no safety, no reprieve. The air felt heavier here, thick with a sense of anticipation that set my teeth on edge. I stumbled to my feet, brushing dirt and debris from my hands, and scanned the tree line. The forest stretched out in every direction, dark and impenetrable, but one path seemed brighter, the light filtering through the branches just enough to suggest a way forward. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. The ground beneath my boots was soft, damp with the moisture that hung in the air, and every step felt deliberate, each crunch and snap of twigs amplified in the oppressive quiet. My flashlight was long gone, abandoned in my frantic escape, and the faint glow from above was the only thing keeping the shadows at bay. The path led me downward, the incline gradual at first, but growing steeper as I went. The air grew colder, the chill sinking into my skin, and I could feel the hum returning, faint and insistent. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, a low vibration that seemed to emanate from the ground itself, resonating through my bones. I kept moving, ignoring the whispers at the edge of my awareness. The flickers of movement I caught in my peripheral vision, they weren't real. Or maybe they were, but acknowledging them would only make it worse. The forest was alive in a way that defied logic, and it wanted me to notice. It wanted me to stop. I wouldn't give it the satisfaction. The path leveled out into another clearing, smaller than the last, but no less unsettling. At its center was a stone obelisk, its surface rough and weathered, etched with symbols that pulsed faintly in the dim light. The hum was stronger here, louder, and the air felt heavier, each breath a struggle. The obelisk wasn't alone. Around it were shapes, figures, vaguely human but raw. They were hunched and still, their features obscured by the shadows that clung to them, and their presence sent a chill down my spine. I stayed at the edge of the clearing, my back pressed against a tree, watching. The figures didn't move, but the hum grew louder, almost a roar now, and the symbols on the obelisk flared brighter, casting long, flickering shadows across the ground. I couldn't stay here. The path continued on the other side, a narrow gap in the trees that seemed to beckon. But crossing the clearing meant passing close to the obelisk and the figures. I took a step forward, the sound of my boot crunching against the dirt, impossibly loud, and the figures twitched. It was subtle, just a slight jerk of their heads, but it was enough to freeze me in place. My pulse thundered in my ears as I waited, my breath hitching in shallow gasps, but they didn't move again. Slowly, carefully, I took another step, then another. The clearing seemed to stretch forever, the distance to the other side impossibly vast. The hum was deafening now, vibrating through the air, and I could feel it pulling at me, dragging me toward the obelisk. My feet felt heavy, each step an effort, but I kept moving, my gaze fixed on the path ahead. The figures were closer now, their shapes more distinct, and I could see the faint glint of light on what might have been eyes, watching me. I didn't look. I couldn't. The ground shifted beneath my feet, the dirt rippling like water, and I stumbled, catching myself on one knee. The hum surged, a sharp spike of sound that sent a jolt of pain through my skull, and the figures moved, slowly, deliberately. They turned toward me, their heads tilting in unison, their empty eyes fixed on mine. "Keep moving," I whispered, the words barely audible over the roar. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling beneath me, and took another step. The figures didn't follow, but their gaze never left me, the weight of it pressing down on me like a physical force. I reached the other side of the clearing, my body shaking, and slipped through the gap in the trees. The hum faded, the air growing still and quiet, but the weight of what I'd seen stayed with me, clinging to my thoughts like a shadow. The path ahead was narrow, overgrown with roots and vines, but it led upward, toward a faint glimmer of light that pierced through the canopy. The ascent was grueling, every step a battle against the exhaustion that threatened to drag me down. But the light grew brighter with each step, and the air grew warmer, less oppressive. When I reached the top, the forest opened into a wide, flat plateau, bathed in the soft glow of twilight. The horizon stretched out before me, vast and endless, and for the first time in what felt like hours, I could breathe. But the peace was short-lived. The hum returned, sharper now, cutting through the quiet like a knife. The ground beneath my feet trembled, and I turned, my heart pounding as I saw the shadows spilling out of the forest behind me, creeping across the plateau like a living tide. At their center was the obelisk, its surface glowing with a cold, pale light, and the figures that surrounded it were no longer still. They moved with purpose, their limbs twisting and elongating, their shapes dissolving into the shadows as they advanced. The whispers rose again, a chaotic cacophony that filled the air, and I realized with a sickening certainty that there was nowhere left to run. The obelisk pulsed, its light flaring brighter, and I felt the pull again, stronger this time, dragging me toward it. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, their voices blending into a single deafening roar that drowned out every thought. The shadows surged forward, and I braced myself, knowing there was no escape. The forest had won. The shadows poured across the plateau, their movements fluid yet deliberate, like waves of ink spreading across the earth. The obelisk at their center pulsed with an unnatural light, its glow radiating outward and casting the scene in a sickly pale hue. My legs felt frozen in place, the pull of the obelisk rooting me where I stood, its light crawling over my skin like a living thing. The whispers grew louder, sharp, and overlapping, not just in my ears, but in my mind, threading through my thoughts like vines strangling a tree. I didn't want to move, didn't want to look away. It was easier to let the pull take over, to let the shadows consume me, and end this nightmare. But some small, stubborn part of me refused. It screamed at me to fight, to run, to do anything other than surrender to whatever was coming. I forced my legs to move, one step, then another, staggering backward toward the edge of the plateau. My breaths came in ragged gasps, the air heavy with the metallic tang of fear. The shadows were closer now, twisting and writhing as they advanced. Their shapes were no longer abstract. They were forming figures, tall and impossibly thin, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. Their heads were featureless, smooth and reflective, like polished obsidian. But I could feel their gaze on me, cold and probing. They didn't need eyes to see me. They could feel me, sense every movement, every thought, every trembling breath. I turned and ran. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, the jagged rocks cutting into my boots as I sprinted toward the edge of the plateau. The shadows surged after me, faster than they should have been. Their movements, a blur of darkness that swallowed everything in their path. The hum deepened, a low vibration that rattled my teeth and made my head pound. And the whispers rose in intensity, their voices blending into a single commanding roar. Stop. Badi. The word hit me like a physical blow, slamming into my chest and driving the air from my lungs. I stumbled, nearly falling, and the shadows closed in, their edges curling toward me like fingers. I could feel the cold radiating from them, a bone-deep chill that numbed my thoughts and slowed my movements. They didn't need to catch me. They just needed me to stop running. But I wouldn't. Not yet. The edge of the plateau loomed ahead, a sheer drop into darkness that stretched endlessly below. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The forest had pushed me here, funneled me to this point, leaving me with only two choices: face the shadows or throw myself into the abyss. Neither option felt like survival, but one offered, at least, a shred of control. I skidded to a stop at the edge, my chest heaving, and turned to face the shadows. They were almost upon me now, their forms towering and indistinct, their movements smooth and hypnotic. The obelisk was behind them, its light flaring brighter with each passing second, and I could feel the pull of it in my very bones. It wasn't just calling to me, it was demanding me to give in, to kneel, to offer myself. El new paradise. My thoughts were unraveling, the whispers twisting and tangling until I couldn't tell where they ended and I began. I couldn't fight it. I couldn't win, but I could make one final move. With a scream that tore through the cacophony in my mind, I turned and hurled myself off the edge. The air rushed past me, the wind tearing at my clothes and stealing the breath from my lungs as I fell. The shadows roared in fury, their cries a deafening crescendo that chased me into the abyss. For a brief, fleeting moment, I felt free, weightless, and untethered, beyond the reach of the forest and its horrors. But the fall didn't end. I plummeted through the darkness, the wind fading, the sensation of movement stretching into something unnatural. The world around me was a void, a space that wasn't space, a nothingness that pressed against my skin like static. Time had no meaning here. Seconds felt like hours, and hours like seconds, until I wasn't sure if I was still falling or if I'd already hit the ground and simply hadn't realized it. And then I stopped. There was no impact, no sudden jolt. I simply was. The darkness receded, replaced by a pale, flickering light that illuminated a vast expanse of stone. The obelisk was here, impossibly, its surface glowing with a steady, pulsing rhythm. The shadows were here too, though they no longer moved. They stood in a circle around me, their forms still and watchful, their featureless faces turned toward the obelisk. The whispers were gone, replaced by a deep, resonant voice that filled the space like the tolling of a bell. You came to me. The voice wasn't human. It wasn't even language. It was a feeling, an idea pressed into my thoughts, undeniable and absolute. I tried to speak, but the air was too heavy, my throat too dry. I could only stand there, trembling, as the obelisk's light flared brighter, filling the space with its cold, unnatural glow. You brought yourself to the altar. The shadows moved then, their forms shifting and twisting as they stepped closer. They weren't chasing me anymore. They were waiting. For me. For my choice. Form. The obelisk pulsed, and I felt its pull again, stronger than ever, dragging me toward it with a force that made my legs shake. I didn't have a choice. Not really. I could feel the truth of it in my bones, in the very fabric of this place. The obelisk wasn't just a door. It was a prison, and the only way to keep it closed was to offer something in return. The shadows parted as I stepped forward, their movements slow and deliberate, as if they were guiding me. The obelisk loomed above me now, its light almost blinding, and I could feel the cold radiating from it, seeping into my skin. My hands trembled as I reached out, the pull overwhelming, and I pressed my palm against its surface. The hum stopped. For a moment, there was silence, true silence, the kind that feels like a void, like the absence of everything. And then the light flared, searing through me, filling every corner of my mind with its presence. I felt myself unraveling, my thoughts scattering like ash in the wind, until there was nothing left but the cold and the light and the endless, unyielding voice. You are the anchor now. The light dimmed, the shadows retreating, and the obelisk was silent once more. I was still standing, but I wasn't the same. The forest was gone. The whispers were gone. But the weight of the obelisk, of the shadows, of everything that had come before, was still there, pressing down on me. I wasn't free. I would never be free. I was a part of it now. Stu. The call came just before midnight, jolting me from the restless haze of unfinished deadlines. And an untouched cup of coffee gone cold on my desk. On the other end of the line was Sheriff Garrison, his voice as tight and strained as the static that crackled between us. A family of two, an older couple, the Thorntons, had vanished. No note, no warning. Just gone. Third case this month, he said. Something's happening in Wrenwood, Carter. Something bad. I grabbed my coat and notepad, stuffing them into my bag as I left my tiny rented cabin. The night was colder than it should have been for this time of year, the air biting against my skin as I climbed into my truck. The road stretched out before me, a dark ribbon winding through the endless shadows of the Cascade Forest. Wrenwood wasn't on any major maps. It was one of those places you'd only find if you were trying to get lost. The Thorntons lived on the outskirts of town, their property nestled at the edge of the Blackvale Woods. When I arrived, the house was as quiet as the grave. The front door hung ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze, the wood creaking like an old hinge. The porch light flickered, casting uneven shadows that seemed to shift and twist at the edges of my vision. Something was wrong here, deeply wrong. I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The living room was untouched, magazines neatly stacked on the coffee table, a mug of tea still steaming faintly on the side table. The air was heavy, thick with the metallic tang of something I couldn't quite place. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass. It was as if they had simply stood up and walked out. As I moved deeper into the house, the unease settled into my chest like a weight. The kitchen was pristine, every dish in its place, the smell of a half-prepared dinner lingering in the air, but it was the back door that caught my attention. And it was wide open, swinging gently on its hinges, and beyond it lay the black expanse of the forest. I stepped outside, the flashlight's beam slicing through the darkness. The ground was damp, the scent of pine and wet earth clinging to the air. That's when I saw them, footprints, leading away from the house and into the trees. There were two sets, side by side, the impressions deep and clear, as if the Thorntons had walked deliberately, almost calmly, into the woods. I hesitated at the edge of the forest, the trees towering above me like sentinels. The Blackvale Woods had a reputation, even among the locals. Stories of strange sightings, of whispers in the dark, of people who ventured too far and never came back. But none of those stories mattered now. Not with the footprints staring back at me. Dare me to follow. The deeper I went, the darker it became. The trees were unnaturally dense, their branches tangled and knotted like skeletal fingers. My flashlight flickered, the beam dimming for a moment before steadying again. The air grew colder, heavier, every breath an effort, and then I heard it. A faint sound, just on the edge of hearing, a whisper, soft and indistinct, like wind rustling through leaves. But there was no wind. The forest was utterly still. I followed the footprints as they twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the woods. The ground grew uneven, the roots gnarled and jutting out like traps, waiting to ensnare me. The whispers grew louder, still impossible to make out, but persistent, insistent. They didn't come from any one direction. They were everywhere, surrounding me, closing in. The flashlight flickered again, its beam catching on something ahead. A lawns, a ponticle, a clearing. I stepped into it cautiously, my heart pounding against my ribs. At the center of the clearing was a stone, smooth and rounded, its surface covered in intricate carvings that seemed to shift and writhe under the light. The footprints ended here, circling the stone before disappearing entirely. The whispers grew louder, sharper, as if they were speaking directly into my mind. My vision blurred, the world tilting as the carvings on the stone seemed to pulse, glowing faintly with a light that wasn't natural. I staggered back, my foot catching on something hard. I turned the flashlight down, its beam illuminating what lay at my feet. A shoe, a man's shoe, worn and muddy. Beside it, a scarf, frayed at the edges, both of them partially buried in the dirt, as if they'd been here for years. But I knew they hadn't. They couldn't have been. The light from the stone flared suddenly, casting long shadows that danced across the clearing. My chest tightened, the air around me vibrating with a low, resonant hum. The whispers turned to screams, deafening and incomprehensible, and I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my grasp. The clearing plunged into darkness, the glow of the stone fading until it was nothing more than a faint outline. I scrambled to pick up the flashlight, my hands trembling, and when I turned it back on, the clearing was empty. The footprints, the shoe, the scarf, all gone. Even the stone seemed dull and lifeless. Its carvings faded and worn, but the whispers remained, faint but persistent, following me as I stumbled out of the clearing and back into the suffocating embrace of the trees. By the time I reached the edge of the forest, the whispers had faded into silence, but the weight of them lingered, pressing against my thoughts like a bruise. The house loomed ahead, its porch light still flickering, and I stepped inside, desperate for the illusion of safety. But the silence inside was worse than the whispers. The air was heavy, oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The Thorntons were gone. That much was clear. But Whatever had taken them, whatever had lured them into those woods, it wasn't done. Not yet. And I had a sinking feeling that it wouldn't stop with them. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the old house, every flicker of the porch light outside, set my nerves on edge. The whispers were gone, but the memory of them lingered, etched into my thoughts like a scar. I sat at the kitchen table, the uneaten remains of a cold sandwich in front of me, and stared at the flashlight lying next to my notebook. Its beam had cut through the darkness of the forest, but now, in the dim glow of the overhead light, it felt useless. What was I even doing here? The Thorntons weren't coming back. That much was clear. But the footprints, the stone, the unnatural light in the clearing, none of it made sense. I flipped through my notes, scanning the fragmented observations and hastily drawn sketches of the symbols I'd seen on the stone. They weren't familiar. No language I recognized, no patterns that matched any culture or history I'd studied. They felt older, older than the town, older than the forest, older than anything that should exist in a place like this. And a knock at the door shattered the silence, sharp and sudden. I flinched, the notebook slipping from my hands, and stared at the entryway. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. I stood, my chair scraping against the floor, and grabbed the flashlight. The cold metal felt reassuring in my grip, but it did little to steady my nerves. As I approached the door, when I opened it, I half expected the forest to be staring back at me. Instead, it was Megan, her expression tight and pale in the glow of the porch light. She was a researcher, a self-proclaimed expert in folklore and unexplained phenomena. She'd been in Renwood for weeks, poking around the edges of the forest, asking questions that made the locals nervous. We'd crossed paths a few times, but I hadn't expected her to show up at the Thorntons' house in the dead of night. "You went into the woods, didn't you?" she asked, her voice low and urgent. I didn't answer right away. Her eyes flicked to the flashlight in my hand, then back to my face, and I saw a flicker of something in her expression. Fear, or maybe recognition. I nodded. "I saw the stone," I said, "and the footprints, but there was no sign of them." Megan stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her movements sharp and deliberate. She carried a satchel slung over one shoulder, its weight pulling the strap tight across her chest. She set it on the table and began pulling out books, papers, and photographs, spreading them across the worn surface. "You're not the first," she said, her tone grim. "The Thorntons aren't the first. People have been disappearing around Blackvale for decades, maybe longer. Most of them were written off as runaways, accidents, even animal attacks. But I've been digging deeper, and there's a pattern." She pointed to a photograph of a weathered journal, its pages filled with spidery handwriting. This belonged to a trapper who lived here in the 1800s. He wrote about the forest, about strange lights and whispers in the dark. He called it the boundary, like it was a place where the world thinned, where things on the other side could slip through. Her words sent a chill down my spine. But I kept my voice steady. The stone in the clearing? Does it have something to do with it? She nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of a sketch she'd made of the carvings. It's a marker, or maybe a door. Whatever's happening, it's centered on that place. The symbols. She hesitated, her brow furrowing. I've seen them before, in fragments. Old rituals, ancient warnings. They're meant to seal something, to keep it contained. But if people keep disappearing, it means the seal is breaking. The air in the room felt heavier. The silence between us, thick with unspoken dread. I stared at the symbols, their jagged lines twisting across the page, and felt the hum of the forest echo faintly in my chest. I didn't want to believe her, but every instinct told me she was right. The Thorntons hadn't just wandered off. They'd been taken, and whatever had taken them wasn't done. What do we do? I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Megan glanced at me, her eyes sharp and determined. We go back, we find the clearing, and we figure out how to stop this before it's too late. The thought of returning to the forest made my stomach twist, but I didn't argue. I couldn't. The Thorntons weren't the first, but if we didn't act, they wouldn't be the last. We left before dawn, the gray light of morning filtering through the trees, as we retraced the path I'd taken the night before. Megan carried a lantern, its steady glow casting long shadows across the forest floor, while I kept my flashlight trained ahead, scanning for any sign of movement. The whispers were gone, but the forest was still raw, too quiet, too still. Every step felt like an intrusion, like the trees themselves were watching us, waiting for the right moment to close in. When we reached the clearing, the stone was just as I'd left it, silent, still, its carvings faint in the early light. But something had changed. The ground around it was disturbed. The dirt churned and uneven, as if something had been dragged across it. Megan crouched beside the stone, her fingers brushing against the symbols, and I saw her flinch. They're fading, she said, her voice tight. The seal is weakening. Before I could respond, the hum returned, low and insistent, vibrating through the ground and into my bones. The light from the lantern flickered, casting strange patterns across the stone, and the air grew colder, sharp and biting. Megan stood, her eyes wide and fixed on the forest beyond the clearing. Say, Tentu, Edituan, Kaul, Tifki, Getty. We're not alone, she whispered. I turned, the flashlight's beam cutting through the shadows, and saw them, figures at the edge of the clearing, their shapes indistinct, their movements slow and deliberate. They didn't come closer, didn't make a sound, but their presence was enough to send a jolt of fear coursing through me. The hum grew louder, the vibrations rising to a deafening crescendo, and the symbols on the stone flared to life, their light harsh and unnatural. Megan grabbed my arm, her grip tight, and pulled me back toward the edge of the clearing. Whatever's holding them back, she said, her voice urgent. It won't last much longer. The figures moved closer, their shapes shifting and twisting, and the light from the stone pulsed, growing brighter and more erratic. The forest itself seemed to close in, the trees leaning inward, their branches clawing at the sky. My pulse thundered in my ears as Megan pulled a notebook from her satchel, flipping through its pages with frantic precision. "There's a way to strengthen the seal," she said, her voice barely audible over the roar of the hum. "But we'll need..." Her words were drowned out as the clearing erupted in light. A blinding flash that sent us both sprawling to the ground. When the light faded, the stone was silent once more, its carvings dark and lifeless. The figures were gone, but the sense of unease remained, heavier than before. Megan stood, her hands shaking as she clutched the notebook to her chest. "We don't have much time." Neither of us said what we were both thinking. So we were both thinking the forest had let us go, for now. But it wouldn't let us go again. Any tool. It wouldn't let us go again. The morning light did little to ease the weight of what we'd seen. The clearing, the stone, the shifting shadows at the edge of the forest. They clung to me like smoke, thick and choking, impossible to shake. Megan was quiet as we made our way back to her cabin, her pace brisk but deliberate, her eyes scanning the trees as if expecting something to lunge out at us. I couldn't blame her. Felt it too. Eerie. I felt it too. The forest was still watching, still waiting. The cabin was small and cluttered, its walls lined with bookshelves, overflowing with worn volumes and faded maps. A large desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered in papers, photographs, and strange artifacts that looked like they belonged in a museum. Megan tossed her satchel onto the desk and began rummaging through its contents, her movements sharp and frantic. I stood near the door, the flashlight still clutched in my hand like a lifeline. "What now?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Megan didn't look up. "Anyways, we need answers. Whatever is happening out there, it's escalating. The seal is failing, and if we don't figure out how to stop it..." She trailed off, shaking her head. "We don't have much time." She pulled out a map and spread it across the desk, smoothing the creases with trembling hands. The map was old, the edges yellowed and frayed, but the lines were sharp and precise, detailing the forest and the surrounding area. Several locations were marked with red ink circles, crosses, and annotations scrawled in the margin. One of the circles was labeled Black Veil Clearing. "This isn't just about the stone," she said, tracing the line from the clearing to another marked location deeper in the forest. "There are more sites like it, part of a network. The stone is just one piece of the puzzle. If the others are compromised..." Her voice trailed off again, but I didn't need her to finish. I could feel the weight of what she wasn't saying. The forest wasn't just haunted, it was alive, its heartbeat pulsing through those ancient sites, through the carvings and symbols that held it in check. And that heartbeat was growing louder, I stepped closer, my eyes scanning the map. So where do we start? Megan pointed to one of the circles, her finger pressing down hard enough to crease the paper. Here, the ruins. They're older than the stone, maybe even older than the forest itself. If there's any chance of finding answers, it's there. The ruins were deeper into the forest, beyond the point where most people dared to venture. The path was overgrown, the trees denser, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blotted out the sky. The air was cooler here, the light dim and filtered, and the silence was absolute. No birds, no insects, just the crunch of our footsteps, and the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind whispered through the underbrush. The hum returned as we approached the ruins, faint at first, but growing stronger with each step. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, a vibration that seemed to seep into my bones, filling my chest with a sense of unease that bordered on panic. Megan didn't seem to notice, her focus fixed on the path ahead, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands tightened around the strap of her satchel. The ruins emerged from the shadows like a memory, their crumbling walls and weathered stones half buried in the earth. The structures were primitive, their shapes barely recognizable as buildings, but the carvings were unmistakable. They covered every surface, their lines sharp and precise, glowing faintly in the dim light. The symbols were similar to those on the stone in the clearing, but more intricate, more deliberate, as if whoever had made them had poured every ounce of their will into their creation. Megan approached one of the walls, her fingers brushing against the carvings. These symbols, they're older than anything I've seen before, she murmured. They're not just seals, they're a language, a warning. I hid back, my eyes scanning the ruins for any sign of movement. The shadows were deeper here, the air heavier, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The hum was louder now, resonating through the ground, through the air, through me, and I clenched my fists, trying to steady my breathing. Megan pulled a notebook from her satchel and began sketching the carvings, her pencil moving quickly across the page. There's a pattern, she said, her voice tense with concentration. They're connected. The clearing, the stone, the ruins, they're all part of the same network. The same prison. Her words sent a chill through me. It's cigar. They do Wayne, too. Prison for what? She didn't answer, but her silence said more than words ever could. Ha! As she worked, the hum shifted, its tone deepening, growing sharper and more insistent. The carvings on the walls flared brighter, their glow pulsating in time with the vibrations that shook the ground. The air grew colder, the wind picking up, and the shadows began to move. Megan, I said, my voice low and urgent. She didn't look up. Just a little longer. I need to. The ground beneath us trembled, a low, rolling vibration that sent cracks, spider-webbing through the ruins. The shadows surged forward, twisting and writhing, and the hum rose to a deafening roar. The carvings on the walls flared brighter, their light blinding, and I grabbed Megan's arm, pulling her back as the ruins began to collapse. We stumbled out of the ruins, the ground buckling beneath our feet, and I turned just in time to see the structures crumble, their stones swallowed by the earth. The hum stopped abruptly, leaving a silence that was almost worse, and the air felt heavier, suffocating. Megan stared at the ruins, her face pale, her notebook clutched tightly in her hands. "The seals," she whispered. It can be written. They're failing." The forest around us was darker now, the trees closer, their branches arching overhead like claws. The path we'd taken was gone, swallowed by the shifting earth, and the hum began to return, faint and distant, but growing stronger with each passing second. "We need to move," I said, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my chest. Megan nodded, her movements stiff and jerky, and we began to run. The forest closed in around us, the shadows stretching longer, darker, and the hum followed us, relentless and unyielding. The seals were failing, the forest was waking, and whatever lay beyond, the veil was breaking through. The forest seemed angrier now, its silence broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath our boots and the faint, ever-present hum that chased us like a second heartbeat. Megan walked ahead of me, her pace quick but uneven, the notebook clutched tightly to her chest. She didn't say a word, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her head turned slightly at every sound, every shifting shadow. The trees were closer than before, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, and the light filtering through the canopy was dim and fractured. It wasn't natural light, it was gray and lifeless, the kind of light you'd see in a storm's aftermath. The air was colder too, heavy with moisture, and the faint metallic tang I'd come to associate with the hum. We didn't stop until we reached a small clearing, the ground uneven and littered with stones and fallen branches. Megan finally slowed, her breath ragged as she crouched beside one of the stones and flipped open her notebook. She began scribbling furiously, her pencil darting across the page, as if trying to outrun the thoughts in her head. "They're connected," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "The seals, the ruins, the clearing, it's all part of the same system, but the pattern is fragmented. Something's missing." I stayed on the edge of the clearing, scanning the forest for any sign of movement. The shadows shifted at the corners of my vision, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. It was as if the forest itself was alive, watching, waiting. The hum was louder now, vibrating through the air and into my chest, and I clenched my fists, trying to focus on anything other than the growing sense of dread clawing at my thoughts. "What happens if we can't fix it?" I asked, my voice cutting through the tension. Megan looked up at me, her eyes wide and tired. "If the seals fail completely, the barrier between worlds collapses. Everything on the other side spills through." She didn't need to explain what everything meant. I could feel it in the hum, in the whispers that had haunted me since the first time I stepped into the forest. Whatever was on the other side of that barrier wasn't meant to exist here, and it was hungry. Megan stood, her notebook still open in her hands, Ah, there's another sight, she said, deeper in the forest. If we can find it, we might be able to stabilize the seals. At least, temporarily. The idea of going deeper into the forest made my stomach twist. But I nodded. What choice did we have? The hum was growing louder, the shadows darker, and the forest wasn't going to let us leave without a fight. The path ahead was barely visible, overgrown with vines and roots that seemed to shift underfoot. The trees pressed closer, their bark etched with the same symbols we'd seen in the ruins, their lines sharp and glowing faintly in the dim light. The hum followed us, relentless and unyielding, and I could feel it crawling under my skin, burrowing into my thoughts like a parasite. As we walked, the air grew heavier, the light dimmer, until it felt like we were moving through a tunnel. The trees were impossibly tall here, their branches forming an unbroken canopy that blocked out the sky entirely. The ground beneath us was soft, damp with moisture, and the smell of decay hung thick in the air. Every step felt like an intrusion, as if the forest itself resented our presence. Oh, Megan stopped suddenly, her gaze fixed on something ahead. I followed her eyes and felt my breath catch in my throat. The sight was smaller than the ruins, but no less imposing. A ring of standing stones encircled a shallow pit, their surfaces covered in the same shifting carvings. The symbols glowed faintly, pulsating in time with the hum, and the air around them shimmered like heat rising off asphalt. In the center of the pit was a pool of black water, its surface perfectly still, despite the vibrations that rippled through the ground. Megan approached cautiously, her notebook still in her hands, while I stayed back, my eyes scanning the tree line. The shadows were closer here, their movements more deliberate, and I could feel their presence pressing against my mind like a physical weight. The hum was almost deafening now, each pulse sending a jolt of pain through my skull. "It's a conduit," Megan said, her voice trembling. "The seals are failing because the energy is being siphoned through this place. If we can disrupt the flow—" Her words were cut off by a sharp crack, like a tree snapping in half, and the ground beneath us shifted violently. The symbols on the stones flared brighter, their light harsh and blinding, and the hum rose to a deafening roar. The pool of water rippled, its surface bubbling, as something began to rise from its depths. Megan stumbled back, her notebook slipping from her hands as the thing emerged. It was dark and formless, its shape constantly shifting, its edges dissolving into the air like smoke. It had no face, no features, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unrelenting, pressing into my thoughts. The shadows at the edge of the clearing surged forward, their movements erratic and frantic, as if drawn to the thing in the pit. They writhed and twisted, their forms merging with the darkness, until the entire clearing was engulfed in a swirling mass of shadows and light. "We have to go!" I shouted, grabbing Megan's arm and pulling her back toward the path. She didn't resist, her eyes wide with terror. As she stumbled alongside me, the forest seemed to close in around us, the trees leaning inward, their branches clawing at the sky. The hum was everywhere now, vibrating through the ground, the air, my very bones. We ran blindly, the path twisting and turning, the shadows chasing us with relentless fury. The light from the symbols flickered at the corners of my vision, their glow growing weaker with every step. I didn't know if we were heading back toward the clearing or deeper into the forest, but it didn't matter. All that mattered was staying ahead of the shadows. The path ended abruptly, the ground dropping away into a steep slope. We slid down, the loose dirt and rocks tearing at our clothes, and landed in a shallow ravine. The shadows stopped at the edge, their movement slowing, and for a moment the forest was silent. Megan collapsed beside me, her breaths ragged, her hands shaking as she fumbled for her notebook. "We need to go back," she said between gasps. "The seals, they're not just failing, they're breaking." I didn't respond. My eyes were fixed on the shadows above, their forms shifting and writhing, their movements slow but deliberate. They weren't retreating, and they were waiting, and they weren't going to wait much longer. The ravine was cold, the air heavy with damp earth, and the faint, metallic tang that I couldn't escape. Megan crouched beside me, flipping through her notebook with frantic hands. The pages fluttered in the faint breeze, her notes a blur of hastily scrawled symbols and half-formed thoughts. Above us, the shadows still writhed at the edge of the slope, their movements deliberate, measured. They weren't coming for us yet, but they were waiting. Then it was I sat against the wall of the ravine, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. My body was trembling, every muscle tight and on edge, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest itself was closing in around us. The hum was quieter down here, muffled by the weight of the earth, but it was still there, pressing against my thoughts like a second pulse. "We're running out of time," Megan said, her voice sharp and unsteady. "The seals aren't just weakening, they're unraveling, and when they go, they'll take everything with them." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I forced myself to focus. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice low. "How do we stop this?" She hesitated, her eyes scanning the pages in front of her. "There's a way," she said finally, "but it's not simple." I leaned forward, my pulse quickening. "Tell me." "The seals weren't just created to hold something back," she said, her fingers tracing one of the symbols on the page. "They're part of a cycle. They need to be renewed, recharged, every few decades to maintain their strength. But the process is costly." She didn't need to elaborate. The weight in her voice, the way her hands shook as she closed the notebook, I already knew what she wasn't saying. The seals needed energy. "It's whole. A sacrifice. How much time do we have?" I asked. "Hi." Megan glanced up at the shadows above, her expression grim. "Hours, maybe less. The longer we wait, the stronger it gets." The ground beneath us trembled, a low vibration that sent loose dirt cascading down the walls of the ravine. The hum grew louder, deeper, resonating through the air and into my bones. The shadows above shifted, their movements growing more erratic, and I knew we couldn't stay here much longer. "We need to get back to the clearing," Megan said, standing and shoving her notebook into her bag. "If we can stabilize the main seal, we might be able to stop the collapse. At least for now." The thought of returning to that place made my stomach churn, but I didn't argue. The shadows were closing in, the forest growing darker, and the hum was rising again, filling the air with a sense of urgency that was impossible to ignore. The climb out of the ravine was slow and grueling, every step an effort against the weight of exhaustion and fear. The shadows didn't follow us immediately, but I could feel their presence, watching from the edges of the forest, their shapes shifting just out of sight. Megan led the way, her movements deliberate but hurried, and I followed close behind, my hand gripping the flashlight like a weapon. The path back to the clearing was unrecognizable. The trees seemed closer, their branches arching overhead like claws, and the air was colder, sharper. The symbols carved into the bark glowed faintly, their lines jagged and fractured, and the hum grew louder with every step. By the time we reached the edge of the clearing, my head was pounding, my vision swimming in and out of focus. The clearing itself was alive with light and motion. The stone at its center glowing brighter than before, its carvings pulsing in time with the hum. The ground around it was cracked and uneven, the earth splitting open to reveal jagged roots and pools of dark, shimmering liquid. The air was heavy with energy, the kind that made your skin crawl and your lungs burn. Megan stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the stone. "The seal is almost gone," she said, her voice trembling. "If we don't act now, it'll be too late." She pulled a piece of chalk from her bag and began sketching symbols on the ground, her movements quick and precise. I stayed at the edge of the clearing, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The figures were there, their shapes barely visible against the darkness, but they didn't approach, not yet. "And, mates, I did say, what do you need me to do?" I asked, stepping closer to Megan. She didn't look up. "I need you to hold them back," she said, her voice tight. "Whatever it takes, keep them out of the clearing until I finish the ritual." The hum grew louder, the vibrations shaking the ground, and I nodded, gripping the flashlight tighter as I turned to face the forest. The figures were closer now, their shapes more distinct, and I could see the faint glint of light on what might have been eyes watching me. I stepped to the edge of the clearing, my heart pounding in my chest. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the figures for the first time. And they weren't human. Their limbs were too long, their movements too fluid, their faces smooth and featureless. They didn't make a sound, but their presence was overwhelming, a wave of cold and fear that pressed against me like a physical force. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice echoing through the clearing. The figures didn't stop. "Endili, Hens, Da." They moved slowly, deliberately, their shapes twisting and shifting As they advanced, the light from the stone flared brighter, and the hum rose to a deafening roar, drowning out my thoughts. Behind me, Megan was chanting, her voice steady despite the chaos around us. The symbols she'd drawn on the ground began to glow, their lines sharp and vivid, and I could feel the air changing, growing heavier, charged with energy. The first figure stepped into the clearing, its movements jerky and unnatural, and I swung the flashlight toward it, the beam cutting across its form. It flinched, recoiling slightly, but it didn't stop. I grabbed a branch from the ground and swung it with all my strength, the wood splintering as it struck the figure's arm. Hey, eerie! It let out a sound, a low, guttural growl that sent a chill down my spine, and lunged toward me. I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my hand, and fell to the ground. The figure loomed over me, its shape twisting and contorting, and I braced myself for the impact. But before it could reach me, the light from the stone flared again, brighter than ever, and the figure stopped, its form dissolving into smoke. Megan's voice rose above the roar of the hum, her chanting reaching a crescendo as the symbols on the ground pulsed with light. The figures at the edge of the clearing hesitated, their movements slowing, and I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the flashlight and stepping back toward Megan. The ground beneath the stone split open, a blinding light pouring out as the carvings flared one last time. The hum reached its peak, a deafening, bone-rattling vibration that shook the entire clearing. And then, all at once, it stopped. The silence was absolute. The figures were gone. The light from the stone had faded, its surface dull and lifeless, and the cracks in the ground had sealed themselves, leaving no trace of the chaos that had just unfolded. Megan collapsed to her knees, her breaths ragged, her hands trembling as she clutched the notebook to her chest. I knelt beside her, my own breath coming in shallow gasps, and for a moment we just sat there, the weight of what we'd done sinking in. "It's not over," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The seal will hold for now, but it won't last. Not unless we find the source." The forest was silent, but the hum still lingered, faint and distant, a reminder of what lay just beyond the veil. The forest didn't feel like it had relented. The figures were gone. The clearing was quiet, but that eerie calm only made my skin crawl. It was the kind of silence that warned of an incoming storm. Megan sat on the ground beside me, her notebook clutched in her trembling hands, her face pale in the dim, unnatural light filtering through the trees. The symbols she had drawn were still faintly glowing, the air around them warm and heavy. "We have to move," I said, my voice low and urgent. I didn't want to break the silence too much. It felt like the forest might hear us, like the hum just beyond our perception might rise again if I spoke too loudly. Megan didn't answer immediately. She was staring at the stone at the center of the clearing, its surface dull and lifeless now, as if all the energy it once held had drained away. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. Her hand gripped the edge of the notebook so tightly, I thought the pages might tear. "Megan," I pressed, reaching out to touch her arm. That seemed to snap her out of it. She blinked, her eyes unfocused for a moment before she turned to look at me. "It's temporary," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "The seal. It's holding, but it's temporary." I nodded, already knowing that. The hum, though distant now, hadn't stopped. It was quieter, more subtle, like a predator waiting in the tall grass. "End of field of a J, though then we need to figure out how to make it permanent," I said. Megan swallowed hard, her gaze flicking to her notebook. "There's only one way to stabilize it," she said, her voice trembling. "The source. We need to find the core. If we don't, this will happen again. And next time, we won't be able to stop it." I didn't want to ask the obvious question, but I had to. "Where is it?" She hesitated, her fingers tracing one of the symbols she'd drawn. "The ruins. The ones we saw earlier. They were rent the heart of it. They were a warning, a marker to keep people away. The core is deeper. It's in the heart of the forest." The heart of the forest. The words hit me like a cold wind. I didn't know what that meant exactly, but I could feel the weight of it, the gravity of the place she was describing. If the clearing had felt alive, if the ruins had felt oppressive, the heart of the forest would be something else entirely. Megan stood, her legs unsteady, and slipped the notebook into her satchel. She glanced at the stone one last time before turning to me, her expression grim. "We won't have much time once we get there," she said. "The closer we get, the stronger it'll be." I nodded, gripping the flashlight in my hand, like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. "Let's go." The path ahead wasn't a path at all. It was an absence of what? Here to the absence of what? The trees were thicker here, their branches arching overhead like the ribs of some ancient decayed beast. The ground was soft and uneven, the roots tangled and jutting out at sharp angles, as if the forest was trying to trip us, to slow us down. Every step was a struggle, every breath heavier than the last. The hum grew louder as we moved deeper into the forest. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a presence, a vibration that rattled through my chest and made my teeth ache. My thoughts felt sluggish, my head pounding with a dull, persistent ache. I glanced at Megan, and I could tell she felt it too. New. Her movements were slower, her steps less sure, and she kept rubbing her temples as if trying to shake off the pressure. "We're close," she said, after what felt like hours. Her voice was quiet, but it carried an edge of certainty that sent a chill down my spine. The forest opened up suddenly, the trees parting to reveal a vast circular depression in the ground. It wasn't natural. I could tell that immediately. The edges were too smooth, the curve too perfect. At the center was a massive stone structure, its surface covered in the same intricate carvings we'd seen in the ruins and the clearing. But these were different. They weren't just warnings or seals. They were something more. Something alive. And the carvings pulsed with a faint rhythmic light, and the air around the structure shimmered like heat, rising off pavement. "This is it," Megan said, her voice barely audible. The core, the hum was deafening here, vibrating through the air and the ground, making every step feel like I was wading through water. The light from the carvings grew brighter as we approached, casting long shadows across the depression. I could feel the pull of the structure, a magnetic force that seemed to draw us closer, its energy sinking into my skin, my bones. Megan dropped to her knees in front of the structure, her hands trembling as she pulled her notebook from her satchel. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the notes with a frantic urgency. "It's a conduit," she said, her voice shaking. "The energy flows through here, but it's unstable. If we can redirect it, we might be able to reinforce the seals." "How?" I asked, my voice tight. She didn't look up. "Envelop. Cell. We need to complete the cycle. The energy has to be balanced. It has to be given freely." I didn't like the way she said that, but I didn't press her. The hum was rising, the light from the carvings pulsing faster, brighter, and the air around us was growing colder, sharper. I could feel the shadows closing in again, their presence pressing against the edges of my vision. Megan stood, her movements slow and deliberate, and stepped closer to the structure. She placed her hands on the surface, the light flaring brighter at her touch, and began to chant. Her voice was low and steady, the words unfamiliar but resonant, and the carvings responded, their light pulsating in time with the rhythm of her voice. The ground trembled beneath us, cracks spiderwebbing out from the base of the structure, and the hum rose to a deafening roar. The shadows surged forward, their forms twisting and writhing, and I stepped in front of Megan, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Keep going," I shouted, my voice barely audible over the noise. The first shadow lunged, its form a blur of darkness and jagged edges, and I swung the flashlight toward it. The beam struck its center, and it recoiled, dissolving into smoke. But more were coming, their movements faster, more erratic, and I knew I couldn't hold them off for long. Megan's voice grew louder, more forceful, and the light from the structure flared again, brighter than ever. The shadows hesitated, their movements faltering, and I turned to see the carvings on the structure shifting, their lines twisting and rearranging into a new pattern. The light exploded outward, a blinding flash that sent me sprawling to the ground. The hum stopped abruptly, leaving a silence that was heavy and suffocating. When I opened my eyes, the shadows were gone, and the carvings on the structure had gone dark. Megan collapsed beside me, her breaths shallow and uneven. "It's done," she said, her voice barely a whisper. For now, but I knew what she meant. The seal wasn't permanent. The hum, though faint, was still there, a distant echo that promised this wasn't the end. Not yet. "Ah, stay." The silence after the light faded was unbearable, and it pressed against me, heavy and suffocating, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. My ears rang, the aftermath of the deafening hum still vibrating through my skull, and every muscle in my body ached from the tension of holding back the impossible. Megan lay slumped against the stone, her breaths shallow and uneven, the faint glow of the carvings casting long shadows across her face. I pushed myself to my feet, every movement deliberate and painful, and scanned the clearing. The shadows were gone, but their absence felt wrong. The air was too still, the trees too quiet. It was like the forest had pulled back, retreating just out of reach, but not gone. Never gone. Engelviel. Taber. Digsumdigtoma. Kedia. Megan stirred, her hand gripping the edge of the stone as she struggled to sit up. Her notebook was still clutched in her other hand, the pages crumpled and smeared with dirt. "It's holding," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The seal is stable, for now." I didn't respond. The faint hum was still there, buried beneath the silence, a distant reminder that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Hemifin, seal, hinsgoon. What now? I asked, my voice hoarse. Megan looked at me, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. "We need to leave," she said, her words heavy with something unspoken. "Egois, adult, the forest won't let us stay here much longer." I didn't need convincing. All of the stone, the way it seemed to reach out and wrap itself around my thoughts, was almost unbearable. I grabbed Megan's arm, helping her to her feet, and together we made our way back toward the path. The journey was slower this time. The forest had changed again, its edges sharper, more hostile. The trees leaned closer, their branches intertwining to block out the sky, and the ground beneath our feet was soft and uneven, like walking on the surface of a shifting tide. The hum grew louder with every step, not in sound, but in presence, a vibration that seeped into my chest and made my heart race. Megan stumbled, and I caught her just before she fell. She leaned heavily on me, her breaths coming in ragged gasps, and I could feel the tremor in her body, the strain of whatever she had done to the seal. "We're close," she said, her voice trembling. "Just a little further." But I wasn't sure how much further she could go, or how much further I could go, for that matter. We broke through the tree line just as the last light of day bled into the horizon. The clearing was still there, unchanged, but it felt different. The zone was quiet, its carvings dull and lifeless, and the air around it was colder, sharper, as if the forest was still watching, waiting for the right moment to reclaim what we had taken from it. Megan pulled away from me, her steps unsteady as she approached the stone. She knelt beside it, her fingers brushing against the carvings, and I saw her expression shift, something between relief and dread. "It's fading," she said. "The energy isn't stable. It's drawing from somewhere else." "What does that mean?" I asked, the words catching in my throat. Megan didn't answer. Right away, her gaze remained fixed on the stone, her hand trembling as she traced the edges of the symbols. "It means the seal is still connected to the core," she said finally. "And if it's pulling from the core, it's only a matter of time before the balance shifts again." I didn't know what to say. The weight of her words settled over me like a lead blanket. The realization sinking in that everything we had done might have been for nothing. The seal was holding, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. The hum grew louder, sharper, and I turned, my flashlight cutting through the gathering darkness. The shadows were back, their forms twisting and writhing at the edge of the clearing, and I felt my chest tighten, my breath hitching in my throat. "Megan," I said, my voice low and urgent, "we need to move." She didn't respond. "You will, Edil." She didn't respond. She was still staring at the stone, her expression unreadable, her hand pressed against its surface. The light from the carvings flared faintly, just for a moment, and I saw something flicker in her eyes. Resolve, maybe, or something darker. "I can stop it," she said, her voice steady now. "I can stabilize the seal, but I need time." The shadows surged forward, their movements more deliberate, more confident, and I stepped in front of her, the flashlight trembling in my grip. "How much time?" "Time?" I asked, not taking my eyes off the encroaching darkness. "Not much," she said, "but it has to be done here." At the source, I didn't question her. There wasn't time. The shadows were closing in, the hum rising to a deafening roar, and the light from the carvings began to pulse again. Brighter and more erratic. I swung the flashlight toward the first figure, the beam cutting through its form and sending it recoiling. But there were more, too many to fight off. Megan's chanting rose above the noise, her voice steady and commanding, and the light from the stone flared brighter, driving the shadows back. The ground beneath us trembled, cracks spider-webbing out from the base of the stone, and I felt a surge of energy ripple through the air, sharp and electric. The shadows hesitated, their movements faltering, and for a moment I thought we might have a chance. But then the hum shifted, its tone deepening, and the air around us grew impossibly cold. The light from the stone dimmed, flickering like a dying flame, and the shadows surged forward again, more determined than ever. Megan's voice rose to a crescendo, the carvings on the stone flaring with one final burst of light, and the shadows dissolved, their forms breaking apart like smoke in the wind. The hum stopped abruptly, leaving a silence that was heavy and absolute. I turned to Megan, my chest heaving, and saw her collapse beside the stone, her body limp and unmoving. I dropped to my knees, shaking her, calling her name, but she didn't respond. The light from the carvings faded completely, leaving only the faintest traces of their existence etched into the stone. The seal was stable. Wa. Limutul. Restarde. For now. For. But as I sat there, the weight of everything crashing down around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had only delayed the inevitable. The forest was quiet, but the hum was still there, faint and distant, a reminder that this wasn't over, not yet, and maybe it never would be. The call came late in the evening, long after the streets of Hollow Ridge had emptied, and the only sound in the town was the wind whispering through the trees. Sheriff Tully's voice on the other end of the line was terse, heavy with a tension that immediately set my teeth on edge. I'd heard him like this before, but only in moments when something had gone seriously wrong. "They're gone," he said. Just 2 words, clipped and final. I didn't ask who. I knew. 3 teenagers, Marcus, Logan, and Ivy. Everyone in town had been whispering about them for weeks, about their obsession with the mines, their late-night expeditions, their bravado about proving the stories wrong. They'd gone into Black Hollow, into the abandoned tunnels. And now they hadn't come back. I grabbed my jacket and keys, the phone still pressed to my ear. How long? I asked, but I already knew the answer. 2 days. Their families haven't heard from them since Thursday night. He hesitated, the static on the line filling the silence. You were right, Ethan. Something's wrong out there. It wasn't like I wanted to be right. Hollow Ridge had always been a quiet place, its secrets buried beneath layers of history and silence. But lately, things had been changing. Lights in the woods. What would you me? Animals turning up dead, their bodies twisted and broken. Whispers in the dark, the kind of things that crawled under your skin and stayed there, itching at the edges of your thoughts. And now 3 kids were missing. The road to Black Hollow was as familiar as it was unsettling. The town faded quickly behind me, replaced by the looming silhouettes of pine trees and the faint glow of the moon overhead. The air was colder out here, sharper, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and decay. My headlights carved through the darkness, illuminating the gravel road and the jagged edges of the forest beyond. The entrance to the mine came into view, a gaping black moor set into the hillside, its edges crumbling with age. The rusted remnants of the old mining operation were scattered around the clearing. Broken rail tracks, shattered timbers, a crane that hadn't moved in decades. Everything about the place screamed abandonment, but it didn't feel empty. The air was too still, the kind of stillness that pressed against your eardrums and made every breath feel loud. I stepped out of the truck, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots breaking the silence. Ekulgus, sorry. Shh, Victoria. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, sweeping over the entrance to the mine. The wooden supports framing the tunnel were warped and splintered. The words "keep out" scrawled across a rusted metal sign that hung crookedly above the opening. I didn't hesitate. The Thorntons' disappearance years ago, the sightings of strange lights in the woods, everything pointed back to this place, and now it had claimed 3 more. Envelop, shivers, abersumi, 3. If there were answers to be found, they were in there. The first few steps into the mine were like stepping into another world. The air was colder inside, carrying a faint metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. The ground beneath my boots was uneven, the rocks loose and treacherous. My flashlight illuminated the narrow walls, the jagged stone glistening with moisture. The deeper I went, the louder the silence became. It pressed against me, filling the space where sound should have been. I could hear my own breathing, too loud, too fast, and the faint crunch of gravel underfoot. But beyond that, nothing. No echoes, no wind, no signs of life. Just the oppressive weight of the dark. Then I saw the first sign. It was faint, almost imperceptible. A scrawl of white chalk on the wall, a looping spiral that twisted in on itself, its lines jagged and uneven. It wasn't part of the mine's history. I'd studied enough about Black Hollow to know that. This was recent and deliberate. I stepped closer, running my fingers over the chalk. Texture was dry, brittle, but the lines felt wrong, like they had been drawn by an unsteady hand, or something not entirely human. My chest tightened as the air grew colder, the flashlight beam flickering slightly. I forced myself to keep moving. The tunnel curved ahead, opening into a larger chamber. My light swept over the space, revealing a cluster of old mining equipment, shovels, carts, broken lanterns, and something else. Footprints. Oh, 3 sets, clear in the dust, leading deeper into the mine. I followed them, each step heavier than the last. The walls here were different, marked with more spirals, more symbols, their patterns growing more intricate the further I went. The air was heavier too, carrying the faintest trace of something sharp and chemical, like sulfur. The footprints led to another tunnel, narrower and darker, its walls closing in on either side. That's when I heard it. It wasn't loud, just a faint whisper at the edge of hearing, so soft, I almost thought I'd imagined it, but it was there, threading through the silence like a needle through cloth. It didn't sound human. It wasn't a voice, exactly, but a feeling, a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the stone, through my bones, settling deep in my chest. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. The whisper grew louder, not in volume but in presence, filling the space around me until it felt like it was inside my head. My flashlight flickered again, the beam cutting in and out, and for a moment the darkness felt alive. Then the light steadied, and I saw it. At the end of the tunnel was a doorway carved into the rock. It wasn't part of the mine. Its edges were too smooth, its lines too deliberate. The symbols on the walls converged here, spiraling inward toward the opening, their faint glow casting the stone in an otherworldly light. Beyond the doorway was only darkness, deeper than anything I'd ever seen. The whisper stopped. I stood there, staring into the void, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't. The footprints led here. Marcus, Logan, and Ivy. They had gone through this door, and whatever was on the other side had taken them. The hum started again, louder this time, resonating through the tunnel like a pulse. The light from the symbols flared, casting jagged shadows across the walls, and I felt the air shift, heavy and electric. My flashlight flickered once more, and in the brief moment of darkness, I saw movement. Something shifting at the edge of the doorway, its shape impossible to define. I stepped back, my heart hammering in my chest. The hum grew louder, drowning out everything else, and the light from the symbols pulsed faster, brighter, until the tunnel was bathed in their glow. The thing in the doorway moved again, closer this time, and I felt its presence wash over me, cold and endless. Then the light went out. The darkness swallowed everything. The darkness didn't just surround me. It consumed me, pressing against my skin, invading my lungs with every breath. It wasn't natural darkness, the kind that came from the absence of light. This was deeper, heavier, a void that felt alive. My flashlight was dead, its bulb cold and useless in my hand, and the faint glow of the spirals on the walls had vanished, leaving me blind and exposed. I tried to steady my breathing, but every inhale felt sharp, like the air itself had turned brittle. Somewhere in the blackness, the hum persisted, low and resonant, vibrating through the stone and into my chest. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like the slow, steady pulse of a heartbeat, or something pretending to have one. I didn't want to move, didn't want to take another step, but standing still felt worse. I reached out blindly, my fingers brushing against the rough surface of the wall, and began to edge forward, one slow, shuffling step at a time. The ground beneath me was uneven, the loose gravel shifting underfoot, and every sound I made seemed impossibly loud. The hum grew louder as I moved, filling the space around me until it was all I could hear. My heartbeat fell into sync with it, pounding in my ears, and I couldn't tell if I was walking toward it or if it was coming to me. Then the whispering started. It wasn't like before. This wasn't faint or distant. This was right there, close enough to touch. The voices overlapped, a chaotic tangle of sounds and tones, some sharp and angry, others soft and pleading. They weren't speaking English. They weren't speaking any language I'd ever heard, but I understood them all the same. And they weren't just words. They were feelings, images, memories pressed into my mind like branding irons. I saw flashes of the mine as it used to be. Workers in soot-streaked clothes, their faces gaunt and hollow. The tunnels were alive with the sound of pickaxes, striking stone, the clatter of carts on rails, and beneath it all, the hum, constant and unrelenting. I saw the fear in their eyes, the way they flinched at every shadow, the way they avoided the deeper tunnels where the spirals began. They knew. Even then, they knew. The whispers shifted, and the images changed. Now I saw the teenagers, Marcus, Logan, Ivy, standing at the doorway. They weren't scared. They were curious, excited even, their flashlights bobbing as they stepped over the threshold. The darkness swallowed them, and then nothing. The memory cut off like a severed thread, leaving only the hum in its place. I stopped, my hand still pressed against the wall, my chest heaving. The whispers faded, retreating back into the shadows, and I was alone again, but not for long. There was something ahead, just out of reach, a faint glow breaking through the black. It wasn't the soft, pale light of the spirals. It was red, sharp, and jagged, flickering like the dying embers of a fire. I moved toward it, my steps quickening despite the fear twisting in my gut. The glow grew brighter, casting long, flickering shadows against the walls, and the hum deepened, the vibrations rattling through my teeth. The tunnel opened into a chamber, its walls lined with more of the spirals. But these were different. They were in chalk. They were carved into the stone, their edges sharp and uneven, and they pulsed with an inner light that seemed to bleed into the air. At the center of the chamber was an altar. It was rough, hewn from the same stone as the walls, its surface blackened and scarred. The glow was coming from the object resting on top of it, a jagged shard of something that looked like glass, but shimmered like liquid. The light from it was blinding, stabbing into my eyes, even as I turned away, but I couldn't stop looking. It pulled at me, dragging me closer with an invisible force that wrapped around my chest and squeezed. The hum shifted again, its tone higher now, almost frantic, and I stumbled forward, my hands reaching out instinctively. The shard pulsed, the light flaring brighter, and the whispers returned, louder and more urgent. They weren't just speaking this time. They were screaming, "Don't touch it." The words hit me like a physical blow, slamming into my chest and driving the air from my lungs. I froze, my hands hovering inches above the shard, and the room seemed to ripple, the walls bending inward, the spirals twisting and writhing like living things. The light dimmed for a moment, and in the shadows I saw them. They weren't fully formed, more outlines than shapes, but I knew what they were. The miners, their bodies were warped, their limbs too long, their faces smooth and featureless. They moved with a jerky, unnatural rhythm, like marionettes with frayed strings, their heads snapping toward me in unison. The shard pulsed again, the light flaring brighter, and the miners stopped. The hum deepened, the vibrations shaking the floor, and I realized the light wasn't just coming from the shard. It was coming through it. Something was behind it, something that didn't belong in this world, and the shard was the only thing holding it back. The miners moved again, their bodies twisting and contorting as they lurched toward me. The whispers were deafening now, a chaotic cacophony that filled my mind, my thoughts unraveling under the weight of them. I grabbed the flashlight from my belt, its dead weight a cruel reminder of how little use it was, and swung it at the nearest figure. The beam didn't cut through them. It passed right through, like they weren't even there. But they were there. I could feel them, the cold radiating off their bodies, the way their presence pressed against my skin, crushing the air from my lungs. The shard pulsed again, and the miners stopped, their heads snapping toward it in unison. The whispers fell silent, and for a moment, the only sound was the hum, steady and unrelenting. Then the shard cracked. It was a small sound, a faint pop that echoed through the chamber like a gunshot. But it was enough. The glow from the shard faltered, the light dimming, and the miners moved again. Faster this time, their bodies blurring as they closed the distance between us. I stumbled back, my foot catching on the edge of the altar, and fell hard, the impact jarring every bone in my body. The shard pulsed one last time, the light flaring so bright it burned my retinas, and then it shattered. The sound was deafening, a sharp, piercing wail that ripped through the chamber, and the light exploded outward, filling the room with a searing red glow. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was the miners, their bodies dissolving into smoke as the light consumed them. And then there was nothing. When I woke, the air was different. The suffocating weight of the hum was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness that felt just as unnatural. My head throbbed, and my body ached as if I'd been crushed beneath 1,000 tons of rock. The first thing I noticed was the light. It wasn't the pale, natural light of dawn or even the artificial glow of my flashlight. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it radiated from the walls themselves, the spirals shimmering with a cold, dull sheen. I pushed myself to my feet, my hands trembling against the uneven floor. The altar was gone, or maybe it had never been there. The shard, the miners, the explosion of light, it all felt like a distant memory, blurred at the edges, as if I'd only dreamed it. But the weight in my chest, the hollow ache that pulsed with every beat of my heart, told me it was real, too real. I stumbled forward, my boots crunching against loose gravel, and realized the chamber had changed. The walls were smoother now, almost polished, their surfaces reflecting the faint light from the spirals. The tunnel leading out was gone, replaced by a narrow passageway that sloped sharply downward. It was a path with no choice. Whatever had brought me here wasn't done with me yet. The descent felt endless. The walls closed in tighter. The further I went, the air growing colder with every step. My breath puffed out in shallow clouds, and the faint glow from the spirals barely lit the ground ahead. The hum was gone, but something else had taken its place. A deep, resonant vibration that I could feel in my chest, rhythmic and deliberate. It wasn't coming from the walls or the floor. It was coming from below. It keeps As I moved deeper, the ground beneath me began to change. The rocky floor gave way to something smoother, colder, its surface almost metallic. The spirals on the walls grew brighter, their patterns shifting subtly as if they were alive, responding to my presence. I tried not to look directly at them. The way the lines twisted and curved made my head spin, and I could feel a pressure building behind my eyes, like something was trying to push its way into my thoughts. The passage widened abruptly, opening into a cavern so vast I couldn't see the other side. The ceiling stretched high above, disappearing into the darkness, and the floor was covered in a layer of fine, silvery dust that glimmered faintly under the light of the spirals. In the center of the cavern was a structure, tall, jagged, and impossibly intricate, its surface covered in the same glowing patterns that adorned the walls. It pulsed faintly, the light coursing through it like veins, and the vibration in my chest grew stronger the closer I got. I stopped at the edge of the cavern, my instincts screaming at me to turn back. But my body refused to obey. There was a pull, subtle but undeniable, dragging me toward the structure. It wasn't just curiosity. It was compulsion, a force that bypassed reason and logic, sinking its hooks into the deepest part of me. I took a step forward, then another. The structure wasn't just a single piece, and it was made of countless interlocking parts, each one covered in carvings that seemed to shift and writhe under the faint light. The patterns were familiar, but they were more than spirals now. They were something else, something deeper. Symbols, words, ideas. They weren't just written on the surface. They were etched into the air itself, hanging like smoke, shifting and twisting as if alive. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the surface. The vibration surged, the patterns flaring brighter, and the cavern seemed to ripple around me. The air grew heavier, pressing against my chest, and I could feel it, the presence. It wasn't just in the structure. It was the structure. It was the cavern, the walls, the spirals. It was the hum that had followed me through the tunnels, the whispers that had clawed at my thoughts. It was everything, and it was awake. The patterns shifted again, faster now, their movements almost frantic. I pulled my hand back, but it was too late. The light from the structure flared, a blinding flash that seared into my vision, and I staggered back, my foot catching on something hard. I fell, the breath rushing from my lungs, and for a moment, all I could see was the light, burning and unrelenting. When my vision cleared, I wasn't alone. They were standing at the edge of the cavern, their forms shrouded in shadow, but unmistakably human. 3 of them, Marcus, Logan, Ellie, and Ivy, died. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide and unblinking, their bodies unnaturally still. But something was wrong. Their skin was too smooth, too perfect, as if they were carved from stone. And their eyes, they weren't just unblinking. Envelop, sugi. They were empty, hollow. They didn't move. They just stood there, watching me, their heads tilting slightly in unison, like marionettes waiting for their strings to be pulled. The vibration in my chest grew stronger, almost unbearable, and I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding against my ribs. "Marcus," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. It sounded ridiculous, hollow, even as I said it. These weren't the kids who had gone into the mine. Not anymore. The cavern pulsed again, the light from the structure flickering wildly. And the three figures moved, slowly at first, their limbs stiff and jerky. But as they stepped into the light, their movements grew smoother, more deliberate. They weren't just walking, they were advancing, their empty eyes locked on me, their heads tilting in a way that made my skin crawl. I stumbled back, my boots skidding on the silvery dust, and turned to run. But the structure flared again, its light burning brighter, and I froze. The vibration surged, the air around me shimmering like heat waves, and I felt it, the presence wrapping itself around me, pressing into my thoughts, filling every corner of my mind with whispers that weren't mine. The figures were closer now, their movements almost fluid, their bodies twisting and bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. I tried to move, to scream, but I couldn't. The light from the structure pulsed faster, and the whispers grew louder, overlapping until they were a single deafening roar. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The cavern fell silent, the light dimming to a faint glow, and the figures froze, their bodies still and lifeless once more. The presence retreated, its weight lifting from my chest, and I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air. The structure was quiet now, its patterns faint and barely visible. The figures stood motionless, their heads tilted slightly, their empty eyes fixed on the floor. But the vibration was still there, buried deep beneath the silence, a reminder that whatever had happened here wasn't over, not even close. The cavern wasn't silent anymore. Peace. The faint vibration beneath the surface was steady and deliberate, like a drumbeat that no one could hear, except in their bones. I stayed on my knees, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figures, Marcus, Logan, Ivy, stood motionless, their faces tilted toward the faintly glowing structure, their bodies unnaturally still. Whatever light I'd seen in them before, however faint, was gone. They were empty now, hollow in ways that words couldn't describe. The walls around me shimmered faintly, their spirals dim but still alive, pulsing in time with the vibrations. I forced myself to my feet, every movement slow and deliberate, and backed away from the figures. My breath came in shallow bursts, every inhale scraping against the back of my throat, and I kept my eyes locked on the structure. The glow had faded, but it wasn't dead. It was waiting. The thought came unbidden, sinking into my mind like a needle threading through cloth. It wasn't just the structure waiting. It was the entire cavern. The spirals, the vibrations, the figures. They were all part of something larger, something I couldn't begin to understand. My foot caught on a rock, and I stumbled, the sound echoing through the cavern like a gunshot. The figures didn't react, but the vibrations shifted, their rhythm faltering for a moment before resuming, faster now, more insistent. The light from the spirals flared briefly, casting jagged shadows across the walls, and I felt a sharp pressure in my chest, like something was pulling at me, dragging me forward. I had to move. I didn't know where or why. But standing still felt like an invitation to disappear, to become part of whatever this place was. My flashlight was gone, lost somewhere in the tunnels, and the faint glow from the spirals was barely enough to see by. I turned, my steps unsteady, and started back toward the passage I'd come through. Except the passage was gone. Where there had been a narrow opening, a path leading back to the mine's upper levels, there was now only stone, smooth, unbroken stone, that reflected the faint light like a mirror. I pressed my hands against it, the cold seeping into my skin, and felt my stomach twist. The cavern was alive, reshaping itself, trapping me. The vibrations grew louder, the spirals brighter, and the figures began to move, slowly at first, their bodies jerking like puppets pulled by invisible strings, their heads turned toward me in perfect unison, their hollow eyes locking onto mine. And I felt my pulse spike, my breath catching in my throat. They didn't make a sound, but their presence was overwhelming, pressing against me like a tie. I backed away, my hands scraping against the stone wall, and nearly tripped over the edge of the structure's platform. The light flared again, brighter this time, and the spirals shifted, their lines writhing like living things. The air grew colder, sharper, and I felt it again. That pull, stronger now, dragging me toward the center of the cavern. The figures moved faster, their bodies blurring at the edges as they closed the distance. I turned, my heart hammering in my chest, and stumbled onto the platform, the surface beneath me smooth and cold. The spirals on the structure were blinding now, their light stabbing into my eyes, and I could feel the vibrations in my teeth, in my bones. It wasn't just sound, it was something deeper, something that reached into the core of me and twisted. The figures reached the edge of the platform and stopped. Out. They didn't climb up, didn't move closer. They just stood there, their bodies still, their heads tilted slightly, as if waiting. The light from the spirals pulsed, the rhythm matching. I realized, with a sickening certainty, that they were waiting for me. They were waiting for the structure. The pull grew stronger, and I fell to my knees, my hands gripping the edge of the platform as the light enveloped me. The spirals were spinning now, their patterns shifting faster than my eyes could follow, and the vibrations rose to a deafening roar. My vision blurred, the edges of the cavern dissolving into shadow, and I felt my thoughts unraveling, slipping through my fingers like sand. The whispers returned, louder and more urgent, filling the space around me with overlapping voices that weren't mine. They weren't angry anymore. They weren't pleading. They were commanding. Release it. The words hit me like a physical blow, slamming into my chest and driving the air from my lungs. I shook my head, the motion weak and unconvincing, and the whispers grew louder, their voices blending into a single, deafening roar. Release it. I didn't know what it was, but I could feel it now, pressing against the edges of the structure, trying to break through. It wasn't just alive. It was awake, aware, and it wanted out. The spirals pulsed faster, the light flaring brighter, and the figures began to move again, their bodies twisting and contorting as they climbed onto the platform. The pull was unbearable now, dragging me forward, and I realized with a jolt of terror that my hands were moving on their own, reaching for the center of the structure. The spirals shifted, their patterns aligning, and the vibrations stopped, leaving a silence that was heavier than any sound. For a moment, the cavern was still. The light from the spirals dimmed, their glow fading to a faint shimmer, and the figures froze, their bodies locked in place. I felt the pressure in my chest ease, the pull weakening, and I hoped it was over. Then the structure cracked. The sound was sharp and jagged, cutting through the silence like shattered glass. A thin line appeared down the center of the structure, glowing with a light so bright it hurt to look at, and the vibrations returned, stronger than before. The spirals flared, their patterns spinning out of control, and the figures began to move again, their heads snapping toward me. The crack widened, the light spilling out in jagged beams that carved through the darkness, and I felt it, something pushing through, something vast and endless, something that didn't belong here. The cavern trembled, the walls rippling like water, and I knew I had to move. I turned, my legs shaking, and ran. The platform dissolved beneath my feet, the silvery dust swirling into the air, and the figures lunged after me, their movements erratic and unnatural. The spirals on the walls twisted and warped, their light flashing in jagged bursts, and the vibrations rose to a deafening crescendo. I stumbled, my hands scraping against the cold, smooth stone, and pulled myself forward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The crack in the structure widened, the light pouring out in blinding waves, and I felt the presence behind me, vast and unrelenting. The whispers were gone now, replaced by a single overwhelming roar, and I knew with a sickening certainty that whatever was coming through wasn't going to stop. The cavern collapsed around me, the walls folding inward, the spirals dissolving into shadow, and the light consumed everything. The light wasn't blinding anymore. It was devouring. It crawled over the walls, into the cracks in the floor, seeping into everything like water, into dry soil. It wasn't just illumination. It was alive, pulsing and shifting like it had a mind of its own. And it wasn't just light. It was something trying to become everything. I stumbled forward, the ground trembling beneath my feet, the silvery dust swirling in chaotic waves around me. The air was heavy, thick with the hum that had returned with a vengeance. It wasn't just a sound now. It was a weight pressing against my chest, making every breath a struggle. My vision blurred, the edges of the cavern twisting and bending like a mirage. and I had to fight to keep my balance. There was no way out, no path back to the surface. The cavern had sealed itself, trapping me in its suffocating embrace. The spirals on the walls weren't spirals anymore. Wah, they'd split apart, their lines unraveling into jagged angular shapes that pulsed erratically, their light flickering like a dying flame. The crack in the structure had widened, the light spilling out in fractured beams, each one cutting through the air like a blade. The figures were gone, dissolved into the ether when the structure began to break. But their absence didn't make the cavern feel any less crowded. I could feel it now. Them, pressing against the edges of reality, trying to break through. I didn't know what was worse, the feeling that I was completely alone, or the certainty that I wasn't. My legs buckled, and I fell to my knees, the cold, smooth surface of the floor biting into my skin. The pull was stronger now, dragging me toward the structure, and no amount of resistance could stop it. I clawed at the floor, my fingers scraping against the stone, but it was like trying to swim against a riptide. The crack in the structure widened further, the light spilling out in waves, and I could feel the vibrations in my teeth, in my skull, rattling me apart from the inside. The light shifted, growing darker at the edges, and I realized with a jolt of terror that it wasn't just light anymore. There were shapes in it now, shadows twisting and writhing, their movements unnatural and impossible to follow. They weren't coming through the crack, they were the crack, an endless, shifting mass of darkness and light, both at once and neither. I couldn't look at them directly without feeling like my mind was tearing itself apart. But I couldn't look away either. They weren't just in the light. They were in me, their presence threading through my thoughts like vines strangling a tree. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat, swallowed by the hum. But the cavern was collapsing around me, the walls bending inward, the spirals disintegrating into fragments of light and shadow. The crack was everything now, the center of the cavern and the source of the pull. And I was being dragged toward it, piece by piece, my body no longer my own. Then I heard it, a voice, low and resonant, cutting through the chaos like a blade. It wasn't human, not in the way I understood the term. But it wasn't entirely alien either. It was something in between. Something old and vast and impossible to comprehend. It didn't speak words. It spoke knowing, pressing thoughts into my mind that weren't my own, filling me with images and sounds and sensations that didn't belong to me. You are the key. The words, if they could even be called that, sent a jolt of pain through my skull, and I clutched my head, my nails digging into my scalp. The pull grew stronger, dragging me closer to the structure, and I could feel the light wrapping around me, pulling me apart molecule by molecule. My body wasn't solid anymore. It was fragments, scattered and reassembled with every pulse of the crack. The voice spoke again, louder this time, its tone sharp and commanding. You must choose. Choose. Choose what? I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the hum, swallowed my thoughts, and the crack consumed everything. The shapes in the light grew sharper, more defined, and I realized they weren't just shadows. They were faces. Boah, mute but and theirs. What a tie faces. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Their features were blurred, indistinct, but their eyes burned with a cold, unrelenting light that pierced through me, carving out every thought, every memory, every piece of myself, until there was nothing left. Open the way, or seal it forever. The crack pulsed, and the light flared brighter, blinding me. The faces shifted, their movements frantic and chaotic, and I felt the pull tighten, dragging me closer to the structure. I could see the edges of the crack now, jagged and raw, the darkness inside it writhing like a living thing. It wasn't a doorway, it was a wound, torn into the fabric of reality, and it was growing. The pull dragged me to the edge of the platform, the light swallowing everything, and I knew I didn't have a choice. If I didn't stop it now, the crack would consume everything. This cavern, this town, this world. But stopping it meant giving it what it wanted. It meant becoming the seal. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the edge of the crack. The light surged, burning through me, and the faces screamed, their voices blending into a single deafening roar. The cavern dissolved around me, the walls folding inward, and the spirals flared one last time before disintegrating into ash. The crack widened, the light consuming me, and I felt myself unraveling, my thoughts scattering like leaves in the wind. The last thing I saw before the darkness claimed me was the faces in the light, their empty eyes locked on mine, and I realized, with a jolt of terror, that they weren't just watching, they were waiting. I wasn't sure how long I was suspended in that darkness, drifting somewhere between thought and obliteration. Time didn't exist here. There was only the stronger now, vibrating through me like a living thing. The faces in the light were still there, watching, their hollow eyes burning into mine, but they didn't move. They didn't need to. The crack itself was alive, pulling me deeper into its embrace, threading its presence through every corner of my mind. Then the pain started. It wasn't sharp, like a cut or a burn. It was deep, an ache that radiated outward from my chest, spreading through my veins like fire. The hum grew louder, matching the rhythm of the pain, and I realized with dawning horror that it wasn't just sound. It was my heartbeat. The cavern wasn't pulling me into its rhythm. Hemni tu es by dagwa, dawati nana. It was changing mine. I tried to fight it, to pull myself free, but my body wasn't my own anymore. My hands moved without my permission, reaching toward the light, the edges of my fingers dissolving into the glow as if they were being consumed. The crack widened, its jagged edges trembling, and I could feel something behind it, pressing against the barrier, waiting for me to give in. The voice returned, cutting through the hum with a force that made me flinch. You must choose. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The light flared brighter, and the faces twisted, their forms shifting and overlapping until they weren't faces anymore. They were shapes, incomprehensible and vast, their edges sharp and indistinct. They didn't belong here. They didn't belong anywhere. The pull tightened, dragging me closer, and I felt the fire in my chest intensify, spreading through my limbs, my mind, until there was nothing left of me but the pain. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat, swallowed by the hum, and I realized I couldn't tell where it ended, and I began, "Open the way or seal it forever." The words echoed through the darkness, each syllable a hammer blow against my thoughts. The crack pulsed in time with the voice, and I saw it, the thing waiting behind the barrier. It wasn't a shape, not exactly. It was a presence, vast and unrelenting, pressing against the edges of reality like water against a dam. It wasn't just trying to get through. It was the crack, a wound torn into the fabric of everything, and I was the only thing keeping it from spreading. I didn't understand how I knew, but I did. The pull wasn't just the crack trying to drag me in. It was the barrier itself, calling me to finish what I hadn't realized I'd started. I was the key, the lock, the door, and if I didn't make a choice soon, it wouldn't matter. The crack would consume everything, and there would be nothing left to save. I closed my eyes, the fire in my chest burning hotter, and forced myself to think through the pain. The voice wanted me to choose, but it didn't care what choice I made. It wasn't my alley. It was something else, something older and colder, and its only goal was to keep the balance. Open the way or seal it forever. Either option would satisfy it. But what about me? What about the town? The people I'd left behind? What about the faces I'd seen in the light? The ones who hadn't made it out? I didn't want to open the way. I couldn't. But sealing it meant something worse. It meant becoming part of this place, this thing forever. The pull tightened, and I felt the light pressing against my skin, threading through my veins, and I knew what it wanted. It didn't just want me to choose. It wanted me to surrender. The cavern trembled around me, the hum rising to a deafening roar, and the crack widened further, its edges fracturing like glass. The faces reappeared, their hollow eyes staring, their mouths open in silent screams, and I felt the fire in my chest surge, the pain threatening to tear me apart. I had to choose. I forced my hand forward, the motion slow and agonizing, and touched the edge of the crack. The light flared, consuming everything, and for a moment I felt weightless, untethered. The hum stopped, and the cavern fell silent, the stillness stretching out like an eternity. Then the fire in my chest exploded, and I was no longer weightless. I was falling. The light around me twisted and darkened, the spirals collapsing into themselves, and the faces dissolved, their hollow eyes fading into the void. The cavern was gone, replaced by something else, something vast and endless and incomprehensible. It wasn't just darkness. It was absence, the complete and utter negation of everything that had ever existed. And I was at the center of it. The fire in my chest burned brighter, anchoring me to the void, and I felt the pull shift. It wasn't dragging me into the crack anymore. It was holding me here, binding me to the edges of the wound, and I realized with a jolt of terror what I'd done. I wasn't just sealing the crack. I was becoming the seal. The hum returned, softer now, almost gentle, and I felt the presence pressing against me, testing the barrier. It wasn't angry. It wasn't even disappointed. It was patient. It would wait forever if it had to. The fire in my chest faded, replaced by a cold, heavy weight that settled deep in my bones. The light dimmed, the spirals vanishing one by one, and the pull eased, leaving me suspended in the void, alone. The crack was gone, the wound healed, but I was still here, trapped at the edges of reality, holding the barrier in place. The cavern reappeared around me, its walls jagged and empty, the spirals reduced to faint scars on the stone. The light was gone, and the figures had dissolved into dust, leaving only the silence behind. The pull had vanished, the hum reduced to a faint vibration that echoed in the back of my mind. I wasn't in the cavern anymore, not really. I was between, the space where the crack had been, the barrier holding the two realities apart. I could feel it stretching out around me, endless and unyielding. And I knew I wouldn't leave this place. Not ever. But the town was safe. The crack was sealed. And that was enough. For now. The silence that followed was the heaviest thing I had ever felt. It wasn't a calm, comforting quiet. It was oppressive, pressing into my chest and wrapping around my throat like cold hands. The crack was gone. The spirals had faded from the walls, leaving behind faint etchings that looked ancient, weathered, almost forgotten. The cavern itself felt smaller now, less alive, as though the energy that had once pulsed through it had been snuffed out. But the hum was still there, faint, distant, like the last echo of something enormous, moving just out of reach. I could feel it in the back of my mind, not as sound but as weight, a low vibration that lingered no matter how hard I tried to push it away. I wasn't alone in here. Not really. Whatever I'd done had stopped the crack from spreading, had sealed the wound in reality, but it hadn't erased what was behind it, and it hadn't erased me. I staggered to my feet, my body heavier than it should have been, like every muscle had been replaced with stone. My hands trembled as I looked down at them, half expecting to see the same hollowness I'd seen in the faces of the figures that had come before. But they were still mine, pale, bloodied, real. For now, at least. The cavern was different now, its shape unfamiliar. The walls sloped inward, the edges of the chamber narrowing into a single path that twisted upward into the dark. It wasn't the way I'd come, but it was the only way left. I couldn't stay here. Not in the heart of this place, where the air still tasted like ash, and the hum threatened to drown me if I let it get too close. Each step was an effort, my legs moving, as though wading through thick mud. The faint glow of the spirals on the walls flickered as I passed, their light dimming until it was barely more than an afterimage. The ground beneath me was uneven, the stones shifting with every step, and the air grew colder as I climbed, sharp and biting against my skin. The path was endless. Time didn't seem to exist here. I could have been walking for minutes or hours, the same stretch of uneven ground looping beneath my feet. But the way the hum lingered in my thoughts made it feel like I'd been here forever. My heartbeat was steady now, slower than it should have been, and I couldn't tell if the heaviness in my chest was exhaustion or something worse. Eventually, the path leveled out, opening into a smaller chamber. The walls were bare here, smooth and featureless, the spirals completely gone. The hum was louder, sharper, vibrating through my teeth, as though it were trying to find its way back into me. At the center of the chamber was a single stone pedestal, its surface polished and untouched by time. On top of it was something small, dark, glinting faintly in the dim light. I didn't want to go closer. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around to run, but there was nowhere else to go. I stepped forward, each movement slower than the last, my breath catching in my throat as I approached the pedestal. The object on top of it was a shard of something. Glass, maybe, or crystal, but it was darker than anything I'd ever seen, its edges shimmering faintly like oil on water. The moment my hand touched it, the hum stopped. The silence wasn't comforting. It was absolute, the kind that made your ears ring with the absence of sound. The shard was cold against my skin, its surface unnaturally smooth, and as I lifted it from the pedestal, I felt the weight of it settle into my chest, a sharp, twisting pain that made my knees buckle. The cavern trembled, the ground shifting beneath me, and I heard it, the faintest whisper, threading through the silence like a needle through fabric. It wasn't words. Not really. It was a sensation, a presence pressing against my thoughts, familiar and unrelenting. You are the seal. Hanon. The shard pulsed in my hand, its light growing darker, and I felt it again, that pull, dragging me backward, down, into the heart of the cavern, where the crack had been. I tried to let go, to drop the shard, but my fingers wouldn't obey. The hum returned, softer now, vibrating through the air, and I realized, with dawning horror, what it was trying to do. The crack wasn't gone. It was waiting, and the shard was its key. The walls of the chamber twisted, the smooth stone rippling like water, and the path I'd taken disappeared, leaving me alone in the endless gray light. The hum grew louder, vibrating through my chest, my skull, until I thought it might tear me apart. I stumbled forward, clutching the shard to my chest, and fell to my knees, the pain in my chest burning hotter with every breath. You must remain, The voice was everywhere now, pressing into my thoughts, wrapping around me like chains. The shard pulsed again, the light consuming my vision, and I saw it, the crack, the wound, still faint but growing, waiting for its chance to spread. I was the seal, the only thing holding it back, and the shard was the tether binding me to it. There was no escape, no way out. The cavern had become part of me, or I'd become part of it. I couldn't tell the difference anymore. The hum was in my veins now, my heartbeat, my breath. And I knew with a cold certainty that I would never leave this place. But the crack was sealed. The town was safe. The people I'd left behind would never know what I'd done, what I'd become. They wouldn't feel the weight of this place pressing into their minds, wouldn't hear the hum in their dreams, wouldn't see the faces in the light. I'd given them that, at least. The shard pulsed one last time, the light fading to nothing, and the hum settled into the back of my mind. A constant, unrelenting reminder of what I was. The chamber was still now, the walls silent and unmoving, and I sat there, alone, the shard heavy in my hand. I didn't know how long I stayed there. Time didn't matter anymore. Nothing did. All that was left was the hum, the weight of the seal, and the endless, empty silence of the cavern. And somewhere, deep in the shadows, the crack was waiting